It was supposed to be a simple night of watching the Wilsons, but when I found the first camera in the shower head, the second nestled in a teddy bear's eye, and the third hidden behind a vent in the master bedroom, I realized I was in serious trouble. Hi everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you today. I know you used this video to fall asleep, so before you do that, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now settle in and unwind. We're new to the area, having recently moved into the expansive Victorian mansion at the end of our street. Mrs. Wilson approached me after church last Sunday, her immaculately manicured nails tapping my shoulder. Knowing that we would only be gone for a few hours, I jumped at the chance to earn some extra cash. She said, "Tommy's an angel," her smile barely reaching her eyes. "He'll be in bed by 8, and you'll have the run of the house now." As I stood in the middle of their lavish living room, my heart thumping against my ribs, I became acutely aware of how Tommy had gone to bed as his mother had promised, and I was wrong to trust that smile. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't until I had settled into the plush leather couch and was about to start working on my homework that I noticed something strange about the antique mirror hanging on the opposite wall. A tiny red light blinked in the corner of the ornate frame, almost imperceptibly, and my curiosity piqued as I approached it, my reflection getting bigger with every step. I started searching the room, my eyes darting from one shadowy corner to the next, and as I did, I discovered a camera in the bookshelf, another in the light fixture, and one even concealed in the potted plant by the window. My mind raced. Were the Wilsons secretly filming me? Or was someone else watching someone who had broken into their house just as they had invited me in? I sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, and my blood ran cold. I had to check on Tommy, and his room was dark except for the gentle glow of a night light. I crept to his bed, feeling relief as I saw his little chest rise and fall with each calm breath. However, as I turned to leave, I noticed something on his dresser. A teddy bear sitting innocently among his other stuffed animals, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light. But one eye was different. It glinted unnaturally. As I leaned in closer, my suspicions were confirmed by another camera in my stomach. As I reached for my phone, I realized with horror that I had left it on the coffee table downstairs. I went slowly down the stairs, each one of the old woods sending shivers down my spine. The house felt different now, sinister. Every shadow seemed to hide another lens, another eye watching my every move. As soon as I entered the living room, my eyes instantly fell on my phone, which was not where I had left it, but rather sat in the center of the coffee table, screen up, as if someone had placed it there. As I was walking to the kitchen, I noticed a phone mounted on the wall earlier, but as I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The phone was gone, leaving behind only an empty bracket and a few frayed wires. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just surveillance anymore. I snatched it up with trembling fingers, fumbling with the passcode, and there was no signal. Of course, the Wilson house was notorious for having poor reception, so I would have to use their landline. My communication system was locked, so I yanked on the handle of the front door and made sure it was locked. Panic clawed at my throat as I tried the windows, all of which were securely locked. A noise from upstairs came from Tommy's room, and I had to get to him, camera or no camera. I couldn't leave that little boy alone with whoever was up there. So I took a heavy candlestick from the mantel, its weight comforting in my hand. I tightened my hold and started to ascend the stairs. Every step felt endless, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. The footsteps above had stopped, but now I could hear something else. A low murmur that sounded like someone speaking softly. I arrived at the landing, pressing myself against the wall, and saw that Tommy's door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. I pressed closer, straining to hear, "That's right, Tommy. You're doing so well, just like we practiced." The voice was strange, deep, and comforting, and it made my blood turn to ice. Tommy was sitting cross-legged on his bed with his eyes wide and unfocused when I looked through the crack in the door at him. The man in front of him was tall and lean, dressed entirely in black, and I could see multiple video feeds from the living room, kitchen, and hallway where I was now standing. The tablet in his hands was what made my breath catch in my throat. He was watching everything. I must have made a sound, like a gasp or a whimper, because the man's head snapped towards the door. I didn't think I ran down the stairs through the living room, my feet barely touching the floor, and I could hear him behind me, his footsteps thundering, gaining on me with every second. Then it was my last hope, and I skittered into the kitchen, my socks sliding on the tile, and lunged for the back door. His eyes met through the narrow opening, and for a moment he stood still, then he smiled. It was a terrible thing, that smile full of malice and triumph. Grass was wet with dew soaking through my socks as I ran across the lawn, and the high fence loomed before me, a dark silhouette against the starry sky. I reached it, my fingers fumbling at the rough wood as I tried to pull myself up behind me. I heard the back door slam open, and he was out of the house. "You can't run forever," he said, calm and confident. "This is my game, and I know every move." I hauled myself over the fence. I was in the neighbor's yard now, but I couldn't stop. I ran through strange gardens, jumping over low fences and ducking under clotheslines. My legs hurt, but I kept going because I had to get help and save Tommy. The neighborhood streets blurred past me as I ran through houses in the dark and silence. Why weren't there any cars? It wasn't until I got to the end of the street that I realized something was seriously wrong. The road just ended. I searched desperately for another way out, but everywhere I looked, I saw the same thing. Darkness encroaching, swallowing up the neighborhood's edges, and in the distance, his footsteps were getting louder by the second. His voice seemed to come from everywhere, and all of a sudden, there was no escape. I sank to my knees, the damp grass soaking through my jeans, and as the darkness closed in around me, I saw him emerge. The last thing I saw before the darkness engulfed me was the blinking red light of a camera recording every moment of my defeat. I jolted awake with a gasp, my heart racing, and the familiar surroundings of my bedroom slowly came into focus. It had been a nightmare, a terrible, vivid dream. Desperate to ground myself in reality, I reached for my phone on the nightstand. From between two houses, that terrible smile was still plastered on his face. "Don't worry," he said, kneeling down next to me. "You're going to be a star." My fingers were shaking when I opened a new email notification that had just been sent. It contained a video file as an attachment, and when I hit play, my blood ran cold. I was running through an endless neighborhood of terror, and he was always behind me. The camera blinked its red light, a silent witness to my newfound nightmare. The twig's first picture might have been a deer, then a raccoon, but the third, followed by hushed voices, told me I wasn't alone in these. I set out at dawn with my backpack loaded with enough supplies for a 3-day hike through the Adra. The trail was supposed to be easy, a well-marked path that even inexperienced hikers could follow. But somewhere around noon I took a crazy wrong turn, or perhaps the turn I'd taken was right and the map was wrong, and I found myself in a part of the forest that felt older and wilder than where I'd started. The trees here grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create as the hours passed and the light faded. I realized that I was completely lost. I should have stopped, set up camp, and waited for daylight, but panic had begun to set in, pushing me forward in the desperate hope that I would come across a ranger station or a road, anything that could lead me back to civilization. The canopy was so thick that only slivers of sunlight managed to penetrate the air, and it was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I thought that there might be other hikers or a park ranger who could help me find my way back when I first saw the flicker of light through the trees and a campfire. I pushed through a dense thicket of branches that scratched at my face and arms and came out into a small clearing, but what I saw there made my heart jump into my throat. It wasn't a campsite, at least not of any kind, and a large military-style tent dominated the center of the clearing. Crates were stacked haphazardly around the tent, their contents hidden, but I should have left, turned, and run as fast and far as I could, but curiosity, that damned human trait, kept me rooted to the spot. I crept closer, my feet moving on their own accord, the tent flap partially open, and I could see movement inside. Shadows danced on the canvas, and I could hear the low murmur of voices. I strained to hear what they were saying, but the words were dimly muffled by the pounding of leaves and the rustle of my own heart. I was so preoccupied with the tent that I nearly overlooked the other details, like the new tire tracks that led into the clearing, which were too wide for an ATV, the sophisticated-looking equipment that was strewn about but was definitely not typical camping gear, and the fact that it was partially concealed under a tarp. I had discovered something significant and illegal, and my mind was racing with potential drug runners, arms dealers, and other criminals. Whatever it was, I knew I was in over my head. When I heard the scrape of chair footsteps approaching, I panicked and dove behind the closest tree, pressing myself against the rough bark to check the perimeter. A gruff voice said, "This could be an animal, but I'm not taking any chances." I tried to back away without making any noise, but I was in too much of a hurry and forgot to look where I was going. My foot hit a fallen branch and the crack echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. I tried to control my breathing to make myself as small and quiet as possible because I was sure they would hear my heart pounding so loudly. They had flashlights and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't come near me. However, a voice called out too close for comfort, so I kept looking. The gruff voice replied, "If it's a ranger, we need to know." I opened my eyes slightly to try to determine how many of them there were through the gloom. I saw at least 3 figures moving through the trees. Perhaps there were more back at the camp, too many for me to outrun or overwhelm. I needed a plan because I couldn't stay here forever, and they would eventually find me. I looked around desperately for an escape route, but the forest seemed to close in on me in all directions, appearing equally dark. For boing, that's when I noticed a narrow space between 2 large boulders that was partially obscured by a fallen log. It was a tight fit, but it might just be large enough for me to slip. I waited until the closest searcher had his back to me, then I made my move, crouching low, and scurried across the open ground with my heart in my mouth. Just as I got to the boulders, I heard someone say, "Hey, over there." I didn't turn around, and I dove for the gap, ignoring the sharp rocks that scraped my sides. It was a tighter fit than I had anticipated, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was stuck, but with one last desperate wriggle, I managed to slip through and found myself in a narrow. Without stopping to catch my breath, I began running. stumbling over loose rocks and exposed roots behind me. I could hear shouting and the beams of flashlights, knowing where I'd gone and that they were coming after me. The ravine twisted and turned, and I followed it mindlessly, praying it wouldn't lead to a dead end. My legs felt like lead and my lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down because the sounds of pursuit seemed to be getting closer. Or was that just my imagination fueled by fear, and I was so exhausted that I thought I couldn't go any farther when the ravine opened up and I exploded onto a wider trail that was obviously man-made. In the distance, I could see lights, a ranger station, or possibly a campground safety. I ran toward the lights, my feet thumping on the crowded ground behind me. I heard angry cries coming from the ravine that they had lost my trail. As I got closer to the lights, I realized it was a ranger station and a lone figure was standing outside, peering into the darkness. I gasped and staggered as I approached the lights. The ranger, a middle-aged woman with a gentle face, caught me as I was about to pass out and said, "Please, you have to help me." Her voice was calm but alert, and as I tried to explain what I had seen, the camp, the weapons, the men pursuing me, her expression darkened as she listened. "Let's get you inside," she said, directing me to the station. "I need to call this in." As we entered the warm, brightly lit building, I felt the adrenaline begin to wear off and be replaced by a bone deep. The ranger sat me down, handed me a bottle of water, and went to make her call. I sipped the water slowly, still in shock from everything that had happened, but the mud on my clothes, the scratches on my arms, and the deep-seated fear in my stomach told me otherwise. The ranger returned her serious expression, saying, "I've alerted the authorities and they're sending a team out now, but it'll take some time to get here in the meantime. I need you to tell me everything you saw, every detail, no matter how small." I nodded and took a deep breath. As I started to tell my story, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that whatever I had discovered in the woods was bigger than me and bigger than this little ranger station in the middle of nowhere. As the night went on, with the ranger taking notes and the clock running down to dawn, I questioned whether I would ever feel safe in the wilderness again, because the forest, which had once been a place of adventure and solace, now held shadows I couldn't unsee. As the first rays of dawn peeked through the windows, I heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching, and with it the promise of answers to the mysteries hidden in the depths of the forest. The lock clicked shut with a finality that made my skin crawl. Through the ranger's determination, I felt a glimmer of hope that whatever was out there, whatever dark operation I had uncovered, wouldn't remain hidden for long. Sarah and I had been driving for hours, our eyes heavy with fatigue, when we noticed the neon vacancy sign of the Pine Grove Motel flickering in the darkness. The place looked like it had seen better days, with the paint peeling from the walls. We yanked at the door handle once, twice, and 3 times, but it wouldn't budge. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped, and whoever had locked us in was still out there. It was only meant to be a brief overnight stay to rest our heads before continuing our cross-country road trip. The night clerk, a wiry man with thinning hair and nicotine-stained fingers, barely looked up from his dog-eared paperback as he handed us the key to room 13 at 11 o'clock. He mumbled, his voice as worn as the motel itself. Our room was small and musty, with faded floral wallpaper and a sagging queen-sized bed, but it had a shower with hot water and clean towels, which felt luxurious. The parking lot had cracks and wooden siding, but it was inexpensive and we were too exhausted to care about aesthetics. Sarah tried to sound upbeat as she checked the lumpy mattress, saying, "After hours on the road, it's just for one night." If only we had realized at the time how mistaken she was. The trouble began at approximately 2 in the morning. We'll be back on the road before we know it. I believed I was dreaming about the lingering effects of a nightmare when I was startled awake by a sound I couldn't quite identify, a scraping metallic noise that seemed to be coming from right outside our door. However, I heard it again, louder this time, followed by a muffled voice as I pushed Sarah awake by putting a finger to my lips to keep her silent, and she blinked at me before freezing as the sounds outside became more intense. Someone was undoubtedly outside, and they were attempting to enter, and we frantically got out of bed, our hearts racing in unison. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, prepared to call for assistance, but my stomach fell when I saw the message that said there was no service geared. Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, and I picked up the old-looking phone on the bedside table. I put it to my ear, but there was nothing, not even a dial tone, and we were disconnected. The screeching at the door became more intense, interspersed with muttered curses, and whoever was outside was growing irritated. I searched wildly for anything we could use as a weapon, but the lamp was too heavy and the TV was fixed to the wall. My eyes fell on the shower curtain rod. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I had just succeeded in prying it free when we heard a new sound, the distinct click of a key in the lock. I swung the curtain rod as hard as I could, and there was a satisfying thunk as it connected with something solid, followed by a grunt of pain. Sarah screamed, more out of surprise than fear, I believe, and lunged for the open door. I was right behind her, my bare feet. There was light, a silent understanding between us, and this was it. We had to be ready. The door swung open, and two figures entered the room. In the darkness, I could see the glint of something metallic in one of their hands. A crowbar or perhaps a tire iron. My heart sank as we ran across the parking lot, the gravel digging into our soles, heading for our car's safety, which was only a few yards away. The office, Sarah gasped already, turning toward the flickering neon sign at the far end of the lot, and we were going nowhere. The cold concrete of the walkway was slapping against us as we ran. The night air was crisp and biting, a stark contrast to the stuffy warmth of our room. When I glanced over my shoulder, I noticed three men pursuing us. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but their intent was evident in the deliberate way they moved, and we burst into the office. The bell over the door jingled cheerfully, matching our panic. The night clerk looked up, startled, and his paperback fell to the floor. "Hey, please," he said, panting. "You have to help us. There are men chasing us." However, as I spoke, I noticed the clerk's expression change from one of alarm or concern to something else. What seems to be the problem here? The door behind us opened, and the cheerful bell now sounded like a death knell. I turned to see our pursuers filing in, blocking our exit in the harsh fluorescent light of the office. I could finally see their faces clearly, and the largest of them had a fresh bruise on his temple where I'd struck him with the curtain rod. That made my blood run cold. "Now," he said, his voice no longer bored but sharp with anticipation. The clerk said, "Boys," as he emerged from behind the counter with a syringe filled with clear liquid in his hand. "You know how I hate it when they run." Sarah gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice stronger than I would have imagined possible under the circumstances. The clerk laughed with no real humor. "What do you want, sweetheart? It's not about what we want. It's about what others are willing to pay for, and let me tell you, pretty young things like you too. Nice price, but the truth of our predicament hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a robbery. This was something much worse. We were nothing more than merchandise to these men, and the highest bidder would buy it." I could feel Sarah tense next to me, and I knew without seeing what she was going to do that we were perfectly in sync with each other's thoughts because we were so desperate that we charged at the closest man. The element of surprise was on our side, and we were able to knock him off balance by Sarah's elbow. We were through the door before the others could react, the cool night air hitting us like a slap to the face. But where could we go? Our car was useless, and we were in the middle of nowhere, the woods. Sarah gasped already, veering towards the tree line that bordered the motel property. We could lose them in there. I didn't argue, just followed her lead as we plunged into the woods. Connected with his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. I kicked his knee, and he went down with a howl of pain. As we ran blindly through the darkness of the forest behind us, I could hear shouts and the beams of flashlights cutting through the night. They knew these woods far better than we did, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, sent a fresh rush of adrenaline through my system. They were gaining on us, and just when I thought my lungs would burst, Sarah pulled me to a stop and whispered, her breath coming. The sounds of pursuit had subsided, but we couldn't be certain if that meant we'd lost them, or if they were simply being more cautious in their search. Eventually, after what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we broke through the tree line, and there stretching out before us like a ribbon of salvation was a 2-lane highway. At first, all I could hear were the ragged gasps of my own heart, but then I heard the distant rumble of traffic. Highway, and I could see the headlights of a truck approaching in the distance. We waved our arms wildly, probably making ourselves look like crazy men to the driver, but fortunately, the truck started to slow down as we got into the cab. The kind-faced trucker was looking at us worriedly, and I felt the first genuine sense of relief since this nightmare started. However, as the truck drove away, taking us to the closest town and promising assistance, I couldn't get the clerk's words out of my mind. We had escaped, yes, but now we had a duty to report what had happened to ensure those men were stopped. Our road trip had taken an unexpected detour, but as the first light of dawn painted the sky, I realized our journey was far from over and had only just begun. How long had they been operating, turning their remote motel into a hunting ground for unsuspecting travelers? I looked at Sarah and saw the same resolve in her eyes that I felt in my heart. The man I thought was just an interested buyer had turned into something much more sinister. It had begun innocently enough. I needed to sell my old Honda Civic to help pay for the semester's tuition as a broke college student. Every dollar counts, so I thought I could get a decent price for it. I posted an ad because I knew I had made a terrible mistake. His fingers closed around them, and his eyes had a triumphant glint that sent a chill down my spine. When Mike contacted me, he seemed ideal. He asked all the right questions about the car's history and upkeep, and he was courteous in his messages. When we spoke on the phone, he had a laid-back, friendly demeanor that made me feel comfortable. We set up a time to meet at a coffee shop close to campus so he could see the car and possibly take it for a test drive. I remember thinking how unassuming he looked when I first saw him, clean-shaven, in his mid-30s, wearing jeans and a polo shirt. He could have been anyone's father or amiable. When we got to the car, he did a thorough inspection, checking the tires and under the hood. Everything seemed to be going well, so he asked, smiling, "I'd like to see how it handles on the highway." I nodded, climbing into the car. Looking back, I should have noticed how he steered the conversation, asking about my family, where I was from, and whether I had roommates, but at the time it just felt like pleasant small talk. Passenger seat. I didn't realize we were leaving town until we had been driving for about 15 minutes. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to sound casual even as anxiety started to creep in. Mike's smile didn't falter, but something in his eyes changed. "I know a great stretch of road to really test the engine won't take long." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry, "and I'd rather we head back because I have a class in an hour." He didn't answer, just continued driving. The buildings grew sparser until open fields, and my heart started racing as I realized how alone we were becoming. "Mike, please turn around." I tried to sound firm and authoritative, but it sounded shaky. At that point, he stopped acting friendly and instead gave me a cold, hard stare. "If you know what's good for you, shut up and sit still." Fear gripped me, and I felt icy tendrils wrap around my heart. I knew that this couldn't be happening because things like this didn't happen in real life, but the increasing gap between us and civilization told me that this was all too. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. My phone was in my pocket, but I knew I'd never be able to call for help without him noticing. Maybe if I could just send a quick text slowly. I looked at the door, wondering if I could jump out, but we were moving too quickly, and even if I survived the fall, where would I go? There were only empty fields for miles. "Don't even consider it." Mike growled as if reading my mind, and I believed him. The menace in his voice left no room for doubt. To avoid drawing attention to myself, I put my hand in my pocket, but before I could reach for my phone, Mike's hand sprang out and grabbed my wrist in a vice-like grip. I tried to hand it over with trembling fingers, but he snarled and wrenched my arm so hard that I cried out in pain. I took out my phone and put it in his outstretched hand, but he instantly rolled down the window and threw it out, the gadget vanishing into the haze of the passing scenery. Panic threatened to take over me. I was now completely cut off and had no way to get help. We drove for what seemed like hours, the scenery unchanging, Mike silent, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and me trying to memorize every turn, every landmark, but it was useless, everything looking the same. Finally, we turned onto a dirt road, barely more than a trail cutting through a dense patch of woods, and the car bounced and jolted over the uneven ground, the branches scraping against the window. I blinked back the tears that stung my eyes, but I couldn't let myself fall apart, so I had to stay alert and look for any chance to get away. After a short while, we came out into a clearing with a rundown cabin. Mike put the car in park and turned to face me, his face unreadable. "We're here, get out," he said. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. In any other situation, it might have been peaceful, but now it felt oppressive, isolating inside. Mike gave me instructions to move forward while holding something hard against my back. I didn't have to look to realize it was a gun. The cabin was as run down as I sank into one of the chairs. Mike pointed to a length of rope he had taken out of a duffel bag, which I had not noticed before. My stomach churned as he started to tie my hands behind my back, the rough fibers biting into my skin. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, hating how small and scared my voice was. Down inside, it appeared, a layer of dust covered everything, and the musty smell of long abandonment filled my nostrils. The implication of Mike's words hit me like a physical blow below human trafficking. The horror stories I'd heard on the news suddenly became my reality, and I felt sick. I begged, unable to keep the desperation from my voice. "You don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone, I swear. Just let me go." Mike paused in his work, thinking about me for a moment. "It's nothing personal, kid, just business. You'd be surprised how much people will pay for a young, healthy specimen like yourself." I knew this might be my last chance, so I gathered all of my remaining strength and courage and waited until he was kneeling in front of me. Then, with all of my might, I kicked out my foot, connecting solidly with his face. Mike fell backward with a cry of pain and surprise, and I wasted no time in throwing myself sideways. Made me flinch. Save your breath. You're not the first to make that promise, and you won't be the last. Your merchandise now, nothing more. I heard Mike swearing and scurrying to his feet, but I ignored it, concentrating on wriggling my hands free. The ropes were looser than I had anticipated, so he must have been overconfident and not expecting me to fight back. With a last desperate tug, my hands came free and I untangled myself from the fallen chair just as Mike lunged for me. I rolled away narrowly, avoiding his grasp, and my eyes darted around the cabin, searching for a weapon or an escape route. It was small, but so was I, so I ran for it, adrenaline giving me speed I didn't know I had behind me. I heard Mike's angry roar and felt his fingers brush my shirt as he tried to grab me, but I was faster, so I threw myself at the window, arms covering my face, and the glass shattered around me, causing pain as the shards cut into my skin. I didn't stop though, and I hit the ground, running for the cover of the trees. Mike's shouts resounded behind me, but I didn't turn around, running like I'd never run before, branches whipping my face and roots threatening to hope gave me a second wind as I started walking, my feet hurting, my body screaming for rest. But I couldn't stop yet. I don't know how long I ran, but time lost all meaning in that green maze. Eventually, the shouts faded and were replaced by the typical sounds of the forest, but I didn't slow down because I couldn't risk it. It was almost dark when I finally broke through the tree line and found myself on a road, a real paved road. The distance wasn't getting any better as they got closer, so I waved my arms frantically in the hopes that it wasn't Mike, hoping that they would stop the car. The car slowed down and was pulled over by an elderly couple whose faces were filled with worry. "Are you okay, dear?" the woman asked, observing my unkempt appearance and the cuts and bruises. I shook my head, and as they ushered me into their car and promised to take me to the police, the truth about what I'd escaped started to sink in. The first drop of blood on the kitchen floor should have been my cue to flee, but I stood there frozen as the old man's kind smile turned into something much more sinister. As we drove towards safety, I silently vowed that I would stop at nothing to ensure that Mike was caught and that no one else fell victim to his scheme. I was alive and free, but I knew the nightmare wasn't over because Mike was still out there, and who knew how many others were like him. I entered the lion's den without finding shelter from the storm. It began as a straightforward road trip to help me decompress after a tumultuous breakup with just me and the open road. I had been driving for hours, the rain pelting my windshield with growing rage, when my old Chevy began making a noise that made me shudder, a rattling, sputtering sound that signaled trouble. I was miles away from the last town I had passed through when the car finally gave up the ghost, shuddering twice before died entirely, leaving me stranded on a desolate stretch of country road. I sat there for a while, listening to the rain drum on the roof, considering my options. Naturally, my cell phone was dead and I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. With a sigh, I put on my raincoat and went outside into the downpour when I noticed a farmhouse set back from the road, my salvation. I slogged through the mud, my shoes squelching with every step. I paused at the bottom of the porch steps because it was late, after 11 p.m., but as I drew closer, I could see more details. The house was old, with white paint peeling in some areas, but it was well maintained, with flower pots lining the porch and bright light spilling from the windows. My watch indicated that they might not even be awake, but desperation overcame civility, and I ascended the stairs, lifting my hand to knock before my knuckles touched the wood. The door opened and an old guy stood there, his face wrinkled with wrinkles from a smile. "I'm so sorry to bother you," I started, but he waved off my apologies nonsense, saying, "That's my wife Martha, and I'm Frank." He gestured to an equally elderly woman. "Hello there," he said, his voice as warm as his smile. "Looks like you got caught in quite a storm. Come in." Relief as I stepped inside out of the rain. The house was cozy, filled with the kind of knickknacks and worn furniture that spoke of a long, well-lived life. Who appeared in the doorway of what I thought was the kitchen? My name is Alex, and I replied, still dripping on their welcome mat. My car broke down about a mile back, and I was hoping I could use your phone to call for a tow. Martha clucked her tongue sympathetically. Oh dear, that's no good, but I'm afraid our phone line's been down since this afternoon. The storm made my heart sink. Oh, I see now, don't you worry, Frank said, putting a cushion on my shoulder. You're welcome to stay here tonight, Martha. For the first time since my breakup, I felt cared for, so it was nice and comforting when you got our guests some dry clothes while I made some tea. Before I knew it, I was sitting at their kitchen table, wrapped in a borrowed robe that smelled faintly of mothballs, with my hands curled around a steaming mug of tea. However, as the evening went on, little things began to bother me, like the way Martha's smile seemed to fall away when she thought I wasn't looking. When Frank spoke, his eyes never quite met mine, and I couldn't quite place it. I noticed a faint coppery smell beneath the comforting smells of baked goods and furniture polish when I got up to use the restroom. I tried to ignore it, but it stuck to the back of my throat and made me uneasy. When I got back to the kitchen, Frank was by himself, washing dishes at the sink. Martha's gone to prepare the guest room for you, he said over his shoulder. I nodded and moved to retrieve my mug from the sink. A single drop of red appeared on the faded linoleum floor, and I stared at it, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. Frank must have sensed my stillness because he followed my gaze to the floor for a moment, and neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he set down the dish he was holding and turned to face me fully. Ah, he said, his voice no longer warm and grandfatherly. I hoped you wouldn't notice that I looked up at him, my heart starting to race. His eyes were cold and calculated, and I asked, hating the way my voice trembled. Frank sighed and reached for something behind him. It's nothing personal, you understand. It's just, well, Martha and I have certain needs, and it's not often we get visitors out here. He brought his hand into view, and I backed away, my eyes darting around for an escape route, and I said, trying to keep my voice steady, you don't have to do this. I'll leave right now. I'm afraid it's too late for that, Alex. You see, we've already decided you're going to help us whether you want to or not. I made a break for it and ran for the front door, but Frank was surprisingly spry for his age. He caught me before I could reach the handle, sinking his bony fingers into my arm with surprising strength. Martha called out, our guest is trying to leave. I heard footsteps on the stairs, and then Martha appeared with something in her hand. And a syringe, I realized with increasing horror. Now, she said in a sickly sweet voice, there's no need for all this fuss, just a little prick and you'll feel much better. I fought, kicking, scratching, and screaming, but they were stronger than they appeared. Frank held me down as Martha approached with the syringe. In my desperation, I lashed out blindly, and my elbow struck something soft in Martha's stomach. I realized then, and she staggered back with a cry of pain, and the syringe fell to the ground. Taking advantage of Frank's brief distraction, I wrenched myself free and ran for the kitchen, my mind racing. I knew there had to be a back door, so I fumbled with the lock until it finally gave way, letting me run into the rain-soaked night. The yard was muddy, and I could hear their voices carried on the wind as I ran. I thought I might be able to hide there or find a weapon, so I headed for the barn, but as I pushed it open, it creaked. My eyes were adjusting to the darkness now, and I could make out shapes, hanging hooks, tables with straps, and something else that looked horribly like body parts, but it was pitch black inside, and I felt my way forward with my hands outstretched, praying I wouldn't run into anything. Suddenly, my foot hit something solid, and I fell hard, landing in something wet and sticky. The coppery smell from earlier hit me full force, and I had to choke back a scream as I realized it was blood, so much blood. I had to get out of here, I had to run, and I had to find help, but as I turned to leave, I discovered that the doorway was blocked. Frank and Martha were standing there, silhouetted against the night sky. "Oh," Alex Mar said in a voice full of false sympathy, "you really shouldn't have come in here. Now we have no choice." I backed away, my eyes darting around for a weapon, an escape route, anything. My hand closed around something cold and metal, a pitchfork leaning against the wall. "Stay back," I warned. Pitchfork held out in front of me like a lance. Frank's eyes widened in surprise, but it was too late. The time sank into his chest with a sickening thud. Martha screamed, a sound of pure rage and grief as she came at me with her bare hands. Frank laughed, a chilling sound, or "What, you'll kill us? Go ahead, it won't be the first time someone's tried." They advanced slowly and confidently, knowing they had me cornered, but they had underestimated my will to survive. With my nails running across my face, we struggled and rolled on the blood-soaked barn floor. My hand closed around a hard object, a hammer that had fallen from a workbench, and I swung blindly, feeling it connect with a dull thud. Martha went limp, and I lay there for a moment, gasping for air as the reality of what had just happened overcame me. Slowly, I got up, realizing that the rain had stopped, and as I straggled out of the barn, I heard sirens, a sound that made my heart skip a beat. Farmhouses' lights painted the night in red and blue, and someone must have heard the commotion. Someone called for help, and I fell to my knees in the muddy yard. I was relieved and shocked at the same time, but I knew that the nightmare was far from over because the things I had seen in that barn and the horrors I had experienced would always be with me. Yes, I had survived, but at what cost? The safe wasn't supposed to be open, and that was my first clue that this. As I stared at the suspicious ledger and the pile of unmarked bills, my seemingly cozy house-sitting job was about to turn into a nightmare. I heard the familiar sound of a key turning in the front door lock, and I realized that I was in over my head. It had all begun innocently enough. I was a broke college student in need of some extra money to pay for my textbooks and maybe treat myself to something other than ramen noodles for once. When I mentioned this to my professor, Dr. Winters, I mentioned that he and his wife needed someone to house when I arrived. Mrs. Winters gave me a quick tour of the house, pointing out the plants that needed watering and the complex security system I had to set every night. "Oh, and dear," she had said, pausing at the door to the study, "this room is strictly off limits, private papers, and all that I'm sure you'll find." I jumped at the chance to spend a week there while they were at a conference. The Winters lived in one of those big fancy houses in the suburbs, the kind with well-kept lawns and 3-car garages. The first few days were uneventful as I lounged by the pool, raided their well-stocked fridge, and binge-watched shows on their enormous TV. It was like a vacation in paradise, but on the 4th day my curiosity got the better of me. I've always been a little nosy, which is what originally inspired me to pursue a career in journalism. The locked study door had been nagging at me, and I couldn't help but peek inside, telling myself that I was just making sure everything was okay. The study was immaculate, with dark wood and leather-bound books that looked like something from a movie. However, what caught my attention was the painting on the far wall. It was slightly skewed, and behind it I could see the edge of a safe. I'm not proud of what I did next, but as I mentioned earlier, curiosity has always been my weakness. I approached the painting with my heart racing, telling myself that perhaps there was a plant I'd forgotten to water. I was only going to look and not touch anything, but when I moved the painting aside, I froze. The safe was open just enough to let me see inside, but it was still open. Panic sounded, so I immediately closed the safe and straightened the painting. My hands were shaking as I walked quickly through the house, approaching, and a male voice called out, "Hello," but it wasn't Dr. Winters. I looked around desperately, trying to find a place to hide the closet, but it was too obvious and I would never make it out the window in time. The man said, presumably into a phone, "Yeah, the safe's untouched. Looks like the kid didn't snoop after all." Were they talking about me? Another set of footsteps entered the room, and a woman's voice said, "Last thing we need is some nosy college brat messing up our operation." That my blood run cold. What operation had I stumbled into? The study door opened, and a pair of expensive-looking shoes appeared. "All clear in here." As they moved around the room, I heard the safe open, papers rustling, and the distinct sound of money being counted perfectly. The woman said that with this last shipment, we'll have enough to expand into 3 more states, and the boss will be pleased with the shipment states. My mind was spinning when the man said that the Winters would return tomorrow and that we needed to have everything in place by then. What about the girl? The man asked. Does she suspect anything? After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, they finally left the study. I waited, barely breathing, until I heard the front door close and a car engine start up outside. If only they knew, I would have tried to memorize as much as I could, and my journalistic instincts would have kicked in despite my fear. The woman finally responded, doubtfully, that she was just some naive student who probably spent the entire week by the pool. With trembling hands, I approached the safe again, which was still slightly open. Inside, I found stacks of cash, the ledger I had previously seen, and a USB drive. Without giving the consequences much thought, I grabbed the USB drive and shoved it in my pocket. I also took a quick picture of the open safe with my phone, making sure to capture the "I heard another car pull up outside" as I was straightening the painting and closing the safe. Panic struck again, and I hurried out of the study, barely remembering to close the door behind me, and arrived at the living room just as the front door opened. The doctor and Mrs. Winters entered, looking happy but exhausted. "Oh, Emma," Mrs. Winters said, "we didn't expect you to still be here. How is everything?" I forced a smile, hoping my face wouldn't reveal the chaos inside me. He handed me an envelope and I thanked him, feeling sick to my stomach. Was this hush money? Did they know I'd overheard? I gathered my belongings and made my way to the door, my legs feeling like jelly, when Emma called. "Was your conference?" They were talking about their trip, and I nodded along with my thoughts. The USB drive felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket. "Well, we won't keep you," Dr. Winters said. "We might need a house sitter again next month. Would you be interested?" I turned to face her, and while her smile seemed sincere, there was a calculating look in her eyes that I hadn't noticed before. I heard myself say, "Just let me know," but as I drove home, my mind was all over the place. I had evidence of something, but what exactly was it, and what was I supposed to do with it? I considered calling the police, but it felt too risky, and I wasn't sure what I had done. When I returned to my apartment, I locked the door and pulled back the curtains because I felt vulnerable and exposed. I shakily turned on my laptop and inserted the USB drive, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. Shipment manifests, names, addresses, financial records, and more were all there. This was not a small-time operation. Rather, it was organized crime on a massive scale, and my professors, the kind doctor and Mrs. Winters, were right in the middle of it. I spent the entire night going through the files, taking notes, and trying to make sense of it all. By when the sun rose and cast a pale light through my curtains, I had to decide whether to give the authorities what I knew and hope for the best. Pretend I'd never seen anything and try to forget it all, or dig deeper and use my journalistic skills to uncover the whole story. I couldn't just walk away from this. It was too big and too important. I opened my laptop and started typing. The suburbs hide dark secrets behind their perfectly manicured lawns and friendly smiles, but sometimes all it takes is one. When her hand touched my arm, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Her fingers were ice cold, and her grip was abnormally strong. As I looked into her eyes, pleading for help, I saw nothing but fear. I wasn't sure where the story would take me or how dangerous it might get, but I knew one thing for sure: my life would never be the same again. The cushy house-sitting gig had turned into the biggest story of my life, and I was determined to see it through at all costs. It was past midnight, and I was on my final delivery run of the night as a driver for a small courier company. Normally, these late-night routes were uninteresting, but tonight I first saw her about a mile back, a lone figure on the side of the road. I realized that this wasn't a stranded motorist, but rather a trap. I'd been driving for hours, the monotony of the rural highway broken only by the occasional flicker of my headlights catching a road sign or the eyes of some nocturnal creature. Road, arm outstretched in the universal sign for a hitchhiker. At first, I drove past the company policy that strictly prohibited picking up strangers, but something caused me to slow down. Looking in my rearview mirror, I saw that she was shivering, her arms tightly wrapped around herself against my better judgment, and that she was in her dark, possibly early 20s. I put the van in park and rolled down the passenger window, calling out, "Okay." She came slowly, relief showing on her face, and she said, "Oh, thank God." Her voice was shaking, and she said, "My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been walking for hours. Could you please give me a ride to the next town?" I hesitated, and my instinct told me to drive away, but it was cold, and the next town was at least 20 miles away. What kind of person would I be if I left her here? I said, unlocking the doors, "Hop in, I can take you as far as Millbrook." Her smile was appreciative as she rose into the passenger seat. We drove in silence for a few minutes, and I could feel her shivering next to me, so I turned up the heat. "My name is Jake," and I tried to make conversation with Sarah by saying, "I'm Jake." She responded with a small smile, and as we spoke, I found myself relaxing. Sarah was easy to talk to, and I felt good about helping her, but as the night wore on, I noticed that she kept looking in the side mirror as if she was searching for something behind us. When I asked her about her broken-down car, her story seemed to change slightly with each telling. "So, what kind of car do you drive?" I asked casually, trying to get the specifics, and Sarah hesitated for a long time before responding, "Oh, it's a blue sedan, nothing special," but I remembered clearly that she had said it was red earlier. My anxiety increased when I realized that we were now in the most remote part of the route, with only dense forest on either side of the road for miles. That's when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror and a car coming quickly from behind. Sarah's entire demeanor changed. When I realized that this wasn't a random encounter but rather a setup, I slowed the van, my mind racing that if I stopped, I was dead, but if I tried to run, Sarah made the decision for me. In that split second of hesitation, she grabbed the gun and said, "Just do it." The grateful, shivering girl was gone in an instant, and someone else was sitting in her place, someone else who was completely cold and dangerously calculating. For a brief moment, everything was quiet except for the ringing in my ears and the hiss of the radiator, but then pain hit me in waves. My head throbbed where it had struck the window, and I could feel warm blood trickling down my face. I blinked to get my bearings, but Sarah was gone. The van swerved violently to the right, and I struggled for control, but the tires caught the soft shoulder of the road. We were traveling too fast. The passenger door was hanging open above me, and I could hear male voices outside saying, "Check the van," someone shouted, "Make sure he's alive, the boss wants him breathing." Panic gave me strength I didn't know I had, so I unbuckled my seat and fell awkwardly onto the driver's side door. Every movement sent shards of pain through my body, but I forced myself to move. The back of the van was in disarray with packages all over the place, but I saw my salvation, a small pry bar we used for stubborn crates, and I grabbed it just as a face appeared in using all of my strength. I swung the pry bar until it connected with a sickening crunch, and the man fell back with a cry of pain. Using the bar, I was able to force open the driver's side door enough to squeeze through, and as I emerged from the wreckage, I got my first clear view of my attackers, 4 of them, including Sarah, all armed. The man was in his mid-30s, wearing a scar down his cheek, and his eyes widened when he saw me awake. All of them were staring at me with a mix of surprise and rage, and one of them growled and raised his gun, but I was already running, driven by fear and adrenaline when I crashed through the underbrush behind me. I could hear them shouting, their voices growing softer as I got farther away, but I couldn't slow down. I ran until my legs felt like lead and my lungs burned, and only then did I let myself stop, collapsing behind a fallen tree. I strained my ears listening. I was lost in the woods, injured, without a phone, and unsure of which way led to safety. I allowed myself a moment of despair, but I couldn't give up. I had to keep moving, using the stars to orient myself. I started to walk. Every shadow made me jump, every snapping twig sent my heart racing, but hours passed when I noticed nothing but the typical sounds of the forest at night as my breathing slowed and the reality of my situation set in. The sky started to lighten as the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, and then, miraculously, I heard the distant sound of traffic. I felt a surge of energy, so I accelerated my pace and followed the sound until I found myself on the edge of a highway, not the same highway as the one I had been on, but a path to salvation, and I flagged down the first car I saw. The elderly couple inside appeared terrified, but they stopped, and I gasped, needing help. Help, someone's after me. They must have noticed the desperation in my eyes because the man nodded, unlocked the doors, and said, "Get in, son. We'll take you to the police." As we drove, I told the couple about my terrifying night, and they listened in stunned silence. At the police station, the woman clutched her husband's arm. At first, they were skeptical of my story, but as I went into detail about Sarah and the others, I noticed that the detective's eyes lit up. "We've heard reports of a group operating like this along I-80. The police found my van, but Sarah and her accomplice had disappeared. I was unable to return to my previous job because the idea of driving those desolate roads at night filled me with paralyzing fear, but in a way, Sarah and her crew had given me a gift, a story and a warning, and I began sharing my experience online, which resonated with people, especially other drivers. This is the first time someone has escaped to tell us about it. Soon after, I was speaking out in favor of improved safety regulations for long-haul drivers and couriers. My near-death experience had given me a new purpose, and although I still check my rear-view mirror more frequently than I'd like to, I know that by speaking up, I might be able to prevent someone else from becoming a victim, because not everyone who seeks assistance on the dark highways is a victim. Sometimes the real danger lies in being too willing to trust a stranger. The first footprint I saw could have been mine, and the second could have been I had always loved camping alone because there's something about the solitude and the unadulterated connection to nature that you just can't get when you're with other people. This trip was supposed to be my escape, a week-long trek through some of the most beautiful and isolated terrain in Colorado that I had carefully planned. However, the third, perfectly formed and definitely not mine, sent a chill down my spine. Someone was following me, and in the vast wilderness of the Rockies, that could only mean one thing: I was being hunted. My only concession to safety was a satellite phone, which I had promised myself I would only use in the most dire circumstances. The first 3 days were perfect, with crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I hiked through dense forests and alpine meadows. At night, I would fall asleep to the sound of a nearby stream and the Milky Way stretching overhead in a dazzling display you never see in the city. However, on the fourth morning, things changed, and I woke up just before dawn. I saw a set of footprints in the soft earth near my tent, as I was always eager to break camp and get an early start. At first, I ignored them, telling myself that I must have made them the night before and forgotten, but as I followed their trail with my eyes, my blood ran cold. They circled my entire campsite, coming right up to my tent at one point, and I packed up faster than I had ever done before, my hands shaking as I packed my belongings into my backpack. At that moment, I wanted to use the satellite phone. I saw some footprints, but what would I say? I had no evidence of any actual danger, and my logical side was still trying to come up with rational explanations, so I continued hiking along my planned route. But I developed a new sense of urgency that made me jump at every snapping twig and every rustle in the underbrush. By midday, I was more worn out from the constant state of alertness than from the physical exertion, so I stopped by a small lake as I refilled my water bottles and attempted to relax. I noticed a figure standing on the ridge above me, partially obscured by a tree. I spun around, my heart racing, but nothing was there. I had just imagined it. The stress was playing tricks on my mind, so I didn't stay to find out. Instead, I grabbed my pack and resumed my journey, not caring about sticking to my planned course. As the day went on, my only objective was to put as much distance as possible between myself and whoever or whatever was out there. When I set up camp that night, I was a complete mess. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. I didn't dare light a fire, instead choking down a cold meal of trail mix and beef jerky because sleep was out of the question. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I sat with my back against a tree, a small folding knife clutched in my hand, straining my eyes against the darkness. There were small signs that someone was paralleling my route, staying just out of sight. I was terrified when I heard footsteps moving slowly and deliberately around my campsite in the morning. I held my breath, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from, but then I heard a low, gruff voice say, "I know you're awake. Why don't you come out and say hello?" I stammered out, "What do you want?" and got a cold, mocking laugh. "Oh, city boy, out here, it's not about want, it's about need, and right now I need you to start running." I didn't need. As the first rays of dawn began to peek through the trees, I heard him not running but moving steadily and confidently behind me. He knew these woods, this was his territory, and I was nothing but prey. To be honest, I ran blindly through the forest branches, whipping my face with my knife, satellite phone, and a small pack with some water and energy bars. Once again, I fled, leaving my tent and most of my gear behind. A sharp crack split the air as I was dialing, sending pieces of plastic and electronics flying across the forest floor. The shot had come from behind me, too close for comfort, and the voice called out closer, but that would be cheating. "This is between you and me, city boy." I had to slow down and gasp for air. I couldn't keep running forever, so I needed a plan. I took out the satellite phone with trembling hands, praying for a signal, but one bar would have to do. Adrenaline, but I knew I couldn't outrun him forever. I needed to outsmart him. I found a stream and began to follow it downstream in the hopes that the water would cover my tracks and mask my scent as I moved. My mind raced, trying to remember every survival tip I'd ever read or seen on TV. After about a mile, I abruptly turned around and started going in a different direction, which wasn't much, but I hoped it would buy me some time and make him believe I was still following the stream. I found a dense thicket and crawled inside till I waited for hours, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, I heard him mutter to himself twice, clearly frustrated that I had lost my trail. As dusk drew near, I realized I had to move because I couldn't stay hidden forever, and I wasn't any closer to safety than I had been this morning. Slowly and carefully, I came out of my hiding place, and that's when I noticed a glint of metal in the fading light, a trap not 10 feet from where I'd been. It was time to turn the tables, so I started moving again with purpose, but this time I laid false trails, doubled back on myself, and used every trick I could think of to confuse my trail and all the traps. If I had tried to run earlier, I would have stumbled right into it. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just tracking me, he was hurting me and driving me towards his traps. This wasn't a game he'd played before, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment hunt. As night fell and I was searching for more traps for indications of his passage, I discovered what I was looking for: my camp. It was well hidden, but in his conceit, he had misjudged me and his prey had turned into the hunter. I watched from the shadows as he returned, obviously upset at having lost me. He threw down his rifle and sat by the fire, muttering curses. This was my chance, so I slipped closer, my hand tightening around my little knife. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. A twig snapped beneath my foot, and his head whipped around, eyes wide. We just stared at each other in shock for a moment before the predator's roles abruptly changed, and then everything happened at once. He lunged for his rifle, and I threw my knife forward, and we collided, rolling on the ground as we fought for our lives. He was stronger than me, but I was desperate, and somehow in the confusion, my knife found Mark. He gasped more in surprise than in pain, and then went still. I scrambled away, shocked at what I had done, but there was no time for sorrow or moral dilemmas. When the helicopter lifted me to safety, I looked down at the vast wilderness below, which no longer seemed beautiful but rather like a place to hide bodies. The authorities found his camp and the evidence of other victims, and the man who had hunted me was wanted in 3 states for a string of disappearances. It took search and rescue 2 days to find me by that point, and by the time I saw my reflection, my nightmare had saved lives. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway after months of hard work and a nasty breakup, so I decided to treat myself to a week-long stay at a secluded cabin in the woods. The listing promised peace and quiet and all the modern conveniences, but deep down I knew that someone had been watching me and that they were much closer than I could have imagined. I stood frozen in front of the bathroom mirror, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. Amenities a city girl like me could desire, and it seemed ideal when I got there. The cabin was rustic but well maintained, with a comfortable living room, a fully functional kitchen, and a bedroom overlooking a serene lake. The owner, a kind elderly woman named Margaret, gave me a brief tour before giving me the keys, and she said with a warm smile, "Don't worry about anything," adding that you have the entire place to yourself and that your nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. If only I'd known how mistaken she was. The first 2 days were blissful. I hiked the nearby trails, read on the porch, and generally unwound from the stress of city life. By the 3rd day, I felt more at ease than I had in years. That evening, I treated myself to a long, hot bath, letting the lavender-scented bubbles relieve the last of my tension. However, I noticed something strange about the mirror hanging on the opposite wall. There was a tiny dark spot in the corner that was hardly perceptible unless you were when I realized what I was looking at. A camera lens expertly hidden within the mirror's ornate frame. My blood ran cold. How long had it been there? How many other guests had been unknowingly recorded in their most private moments with shaking hands? I started searching the rest of the bathroom now that I knew what to look for, and I found 2 more. I was so intrigued that I wrapped myself in a towel after getting out of the tub. There were cameras everywhere, including in the light fixture, the living room, the kitchen, and even on the porch. I felt violated, exposed, and completely terrified. I grabbed my phone, prepared to call the police, but there was no signal because I was obviously miles away from the closest cell tower. Then I heard a soft creak coming from somewhere in the house, and I froze, straining my ears to hear it again. This time, footsteps. Was inside, and I frantically searched for a weapon or anything I could use to protect myself. My eyes fell upon a heavy brass candlestick on the mantel, and I grabbed it, finding its weight comforting in my hands. Footsteps were coming from the hallway, and I was standing in the living room when I raised the candlestick, my heart thumping so loudly that I was certain I could hear them. Suddenly, a tall, lean man with a face I instantly recognized. It was Margaret Mare, the owner, or rather Margaret without her wig. He said, "Make up well," but his voice no longer has the warm, motherly tone I remembered. It looks like my little mouse has figured out the game. I gripped the candlestick tighter, and he laughed, making me shiver. "Who am I?" he asked. "What do you want?" The implication of his words made me feel sick. "How long have the cameras been here?" "Oh, years now," he said, taking a step closer. I backed away, keeping the coffee. I'm calling the police because you're a sick bastard. He laughed again and took something out of his pocket, including my cell phone. I'm afraid that won't be possible, so you should be more careful with your belongings. I looked at the door, wondering if I could run away, but he was blocking the only exit and I knew he'd be on me in seconds if I tried. You'd be amazed how much people will pay for the right kind of footage, and you, my dear, have been quite the star performer. The thought of giving in to this monster made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to look defeated, my shoulders slumping as I lowered the candlestick. That's better, he said, his tone now becoming businesslike. We have two options here. One, you can try to fight to run. I promise you it won't end well. Or two, you can be a good girl and do exactly as I say. Who knows, you might even enjoy your new career. He took another step closer, knowing you'd see reason, so I made my move. Reaching for me, I swung the candlestick with all my strength, and it struck his head with a sickening thud, causing him to crumple to the ground. I didn't wait to see if he was unconscious. Instead, I ran, grabbing my phone from where it had fallen, and I bounded out of the cabin into the cool night air, my bare feet slapping against the dirt path as I ran towards the main road. I could hear him shouting threats and profanities behind me, but fear gave me speed I didn't realize I had. I ran until my legs felt like jelly and my lungs burned. I was finally fortunate to see headlights in the distance. I waved my arms in a desperate attempt to get the car to stop, and when it slowed and eventually pulled over, an elderly couple looked out at me with worried expressions. I gasped, "You have to help me," because there was a man pursuing me. They didn't ask any questions, so the woman opened the back door and I rushed in as we drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw a figure emerge from the woods, and even from a distance I could feel his rage. At the police station, my story was met with initial skepticism, but when they raided the cabin, they discovered hard drives full of footage of me and innumerable other victims. The man, whose true name was Gerald Simmons, was arrested after the investigation showed that he had been running a sophisticated operation for years, selling the videos on the dark web to voyeurs with deep pockets. In the weeks that followed, I found it difficult to accept the violation, the fear, and the knowledge that private parts of my life were now public knowledge. I'd be lying if I said I was completely over it, but I still check for cameras everywhere I go and still have nightmares about being watched. I'm healing slowly but surely, and every time I share my story, I see the recognition. They may have been seen by who knows how many people, but as I worked with a therapist and connected with other survivors, I found my voice and began speaking out in favor of stricter regulations on vacation rentals and raising awareness about hidden cameras. The first gunshot broke the silence of the night, and with it my illusion of safety, and I knew that something positive had emerged from my nightmare, because now, instead of seeing a victim in the mirror, I see a survivor, a fighter, and a protector. The cabin in the woods took something from me, yes, but it also gave me a purpose, and in the end, that's worth more than any peaceful getaway ever could be. I realized that this wasn't just a routine break-in, but something much more dangerous, and I was stuck in the middle of it. I had been working as a night security guard at the Millbrook Industrial Complex for just over 3 months, and I thought my job was easy. The complex was a vast maze of office buildings and warehouses on the outskirts of town, but at night it was a ghost town. My job was to make rounds, check the locks, and keep an eye on the security cameras. That night began like any other when I arrived for work at 10 p.m. We completed our customary handover after releasing Dave, the night watchman. There was nothing unusual to report. It was as quiet as a graveyard outside. Dave laughed as he departed, saying, "Try not to fall asleep, Jake." If only he knew how wrong he was. It was approximately 2 in the morning. I was in the main security office when I first realized something wasn't right. My eyes were watering as I gazed at the bank of monitors that displayed feeds from cameras across the complex. Suddenly, I sat up straighter after seeing a flicker of shadow that didn't belong on one of the screens. There was a figure running between buildings on another camera, and my heart rate increased. This wasn't a teenager seeking excitement or a homeless person seeking refuge. Their deliberate and swift movements suggested something more sinister. I was about to call the police when the alarm went off and red lights flashed across the monitors as several security breaches were discovered at once. This was a well-coordinated professional operation, and I was reaching for my radio to notify the off-site security team when I knew I should stay put, lock the door, and wait for the police. That's what we were trained to do. But something inside of me couldn't just sit there. I had to know what they were after and try to stop them if I could. I grabbed my flashlight and key card and slipped out of the security office. The complex was eerily quiet now that the alarm arms had shut off. The first gunshot echoed through the empty complex, and I saw muzzle flashes on one of the cameras. My blood ran cold. I heard muffled voices and the sound of breaking glass automatically after 60 seconds to avoid drawing too much attention from a distance. I moved carefully through the maze of corridors, my shoes squeaking on the polished floors, and every shadow seemed to move. The tense silence was amplified by every sound, and as I rounded a corner, I saw 3 men in black wearing ski masks, trying to enter one of the high-security labs, the kind that even I didn't have access to. I ducked back behind the corner, my heart racing. I looked around desperately for anything I could use as a weapon or a distraction, and my eyes fell on the fire alarm on the wall. It was a risk that the noise would alert the intruders to my presence, but it might also scare them off, so I took a deep breath, smashed the glass, and pulled the lever. What the hell was I doing? I was a rent-a-cop with a flashlight up against armed intruders. This was insane, but I couldn't just walk away. I heard cries of surprise and rage from around the corner, using the chaos as cover. I looked around the edge and saw that the men were no longer at the lab door. Instead, they were running towards the exit. Relief flooded through me. It had worked, because they were leaving, but then one of them stopped, turning back, and even through the ski mask, I could see his eyes narrow as they landed on me. "Hey," he shouted, raising his gun, and I didn't think I ran. Bullets whizzed past. I could hear their footsteps behind me as I ran down the corridor, zigzagging to make myself a harder target. My only advantage was that I knew the complex's layout better than they did. I took a sharp left and then a right, which led them deeper into the maze of hallways. My lungs burned as I ran, fear and adrenaline pushing me faster than I'd ever moved. I needed a place to hide, somewhere I could lose them, and the basement level was a warren of the basement level was dark. Emergency lights were casting long shadows, and I ran down the main corridor with my wet shoes slipping on the concrete floor left and right. I changed my direction and headed for the closest stairwell. The sound of pursuit was getting closer now, and their cries were resonating off the walls. I practically flew down the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. I heard the door slam open again, and they were right on my heels. My chest felt like it was about to burst, but I didn't dare slow down. Eventually, I found what I was looking for, a tiny maintenance closet hidden in a corner. I yanked the door open, squeezed inside, and pulled it shut behind me. The closet was tiny, barely large enough for me to stand in, and it smelled damp and like cleaning supplies. I held my breath, straining my ears to hear any footsteps approaching, slowing as they got closer to my hiding place. Could hear them breathing heavily just on the other side of the thin door where he went. One of them growled and checked every door, and another said, "He's got to be here somewhere." I closed my eyes and willed myself to become invisible, and I tightened my hand around my flashlight, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. The doorknob rattled, and I tensed, bracing myself for the worst, but then I heard a sound that made my heart hurt. Police sirens getting louder. The story spilled out of me in a rush, breaking the chase as the sun rose, casting long shadows across the complex. I sat in the back of an ambulance with the shock blanket draped over my shoulders. The police had caught 2 of the 3 intruders as they attempted to escape, and the third was still. I remained in that closet, shaking with adrenaline and relief, until I heard the unmistakable sound of police radios and multiple footsteps. "You took one hell of a risk tonight, Jake," said Sarah Chin, the lead investigator at large, with a grim expression on her face. "Thanks to you, we were able to stop a major theft at that lab they were trying to break into, which contains prototype technology worth millions." I nodded, still processing what had happened, and asked Detective Chin, "Who were they?" "Professional thieves working for a rival company. We've been tracking their operation for months, but we never 12 hours ago, I was a board security guard counting down the minutes until my shift ended, and now I was being recruited by the police." As I watched the sun rise over the industrial complex, casting a golden glow over the scene of my night-long ordeal, I realized that life can change in an instant. I expect them to be this bold. She paused and fixed me with a serious look. "You know, the department could use someone with your quick thinking and bravery. Have you ever considered a career in law enforcement?" I couldn't help but laugh. I wasn't sure if I would accept Detective Chan's offer, but I did know that I would never look at my dull security job the same way again, because sometimes the most mundane nights can turn into the most amazing adventures. And sometimes the person you least expect to be a hero, even yourself, can step up to the plate when it matters most in the moment the door slams shut. It was supposed to be a routine showing as a real estate agent in the affluent neighborhood of Oakwood Hills. I'd done hundreds of these. The Jensen property was a gem, a sprawling 6-bedroom mansion with all the bells and whistles the wealthy clients in this area desired. However, the sound echoed through the empty house with a finality that sent chills down my spine. I was trapped, and the family-friendly facade of my clients had just crumbled away, revealing something far more sinister. I remember thinking how fortunate I was when I pulled up to the Jensen house on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The Carters were already waiting, looking picture-perfect in their country club attire, and Mrs. Reeves and Mr. Carter greeted me. The Carters were a successful businessman, his elegant wife, and their 2 well-behaved children. They had the means and the motivation to make a quick sale. When they contacted me to view the property, I was thrilled. "Shall we begin the tour?" I said with my best sales smile, "Thank you for meeting us on such short notice. Please call me Sarah." As we went through the house, I pointed out all of its features, from the gourmet kitchen to the opulent master suite. The Carter seemed impressed and asked all the right questions. Mrs. Carter was especially interested in the security system, which I assured her was top of the line. It wasn't until we got to the basement that things started to feel off. Mr. Carter's questions became more focused and pointed. As we ascended the stairs back to the main floor, I felt Mrs. Carter's hand on my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Sarah, dear," she said in a sickly sweet voice, "would you mind if we took another look at the master bedroom? I have a few more questions about the closet space." I nodded, leading the way back upstairs. Mr. Carter and the kids remained in the living room, absorbed in their conversation. The layout in any potential hidden spaces, you never know when you might need a panic room, he joked. I started my usual tirade about the custom cabinetry and designer fixtures in the master bedroom, which was at the end of a long hallway. Mrs. Carter didn't listen, though, and she was staring at me with such intensity that it made my skin crawl. "You know, Sarah," she said, taking a step closer, "we're not really here to buy a house." My heart skipped a beat, and I apologized for not understanding. Her smile widened, exposing too many teeth. "Oh, I think you do, or at least you will," she said. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of their cold, cruel laughter. When I woke up, I was in a dimly lit room and didn't realize my head was pounding and my mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. I turned around and saw Mr. Carter standing behind me with an empty syringe in his hand. What had he done to me? I slurred my vision already, and it's already beginning to blur. Don't worry, Mrs. Carter said, everything will make sense soon. The realization that I was in a cell of some kind, with concrete walls and a heavy metal door as the only way out, caused me to panic as memories of the Carters and the house with the injection came flooding back. I tried to stand, but my legs were unsteady, and I stumbled, which is when I noticed the chain, a thick metal shackle fastened around my ankle, connected to a bolt in the floor. Hours went by, or perhaps it was days went by without meaning in that windowless room, and I alternated between desperate attempts to get out and depressing moments when I sobbed in the corner. Eventually, the door opened and Mr. Carter entered, looking as sharp as ever in his pricey suit. "Good, you're awake," he said, as if we were having a business lunch. "I hope your accommodations are adequate. Why are you doing this?" I screamed, my voice hoarse, and he laughed. "Why does anyone do anything, Sarah, for profit?" The implication of his words hit me like a physical blow. Human trafficking, the horror stories I'd heard on the news, suddenly became my reality. "You won't get away with this," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "The police would search for me," and he laughed. "My dear, we've been doing this for years, and by the time anyone notices you're missing, you'll be long gone. Are people willing to pay a lot of money for someone like you? You're young, attractive, and educated. We have a long journey ahead of us tomorrow," and as the door slammed shut, I felt something inside me break. This was really happening. I was going to be sold like cattle and shipped off to God knows where, never to be seen again. However, as the initial shock wore off, something else took its place: anger and determination. I refused to be a victim. This is a surprisingly common occurrence. He turned to leave, pausing at the door to try to get some rest. On my way out, I inspected every square inch of my cell for weaknesses. The walls were impenetrable and the chain was solid, but the door's hinges appeared to be old and rusty. If I could get to them, I tore a piece of fabric from my blouse and started braiding it to make it as strong as possible. Next, I worked on the bolt in the floor, which was secure, but the concrete surrounding it was crumbling. If I could loosen it enough, hours went by, my fingers getting raw and bloody, but at last, I felt the bolt give way and I was free of this was my only chance, so I used my makeshift rope to reach the door hinges, which were as weak as I had hoped. With enough pressure, they started to creak and bend, and just as I heard the satisfying snap of the last hinge giving way, footsteps echoed down the hall as they approached. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, my heart pounding, and the door swung open and Mrs. Carter stepped in. "Time to go, dear. You're new." I didn't let her finish, though, because I slammed into her with all my might, knocking her off balance and hitting her head on with a sickening thud. I ran down the hallway, thinking there were endless doors on either side, and I heard heavy footsteps behind me. Giving chase. I turned a corner and saw a window. Without hesitation, I threw myself at it. The glass shattered, and I felt a searing pain as the shards cut into my skin, but I didn't stop. I tumbled out onto soft grass, the cool night air hitting my face. I was in a backyard with high fences on all sides, but there was a gate of freedom in the corner, and I ran like I had never run before. In a single, adrenaline-fueled leap, I jumped over the gate and found myself on a quiet suburban street with lights on in nearby houses. I ran to the closest one and pounded on the door, pleading with someone to call the police. An elderly woman opened the door, her eyes widening in shock at my appearance. I must have looked like a madwoman, covered in blood and dirt, my clothes torn. I gasped, thinking they were going to kill me. She ushered me inside and dialed 911 while we waited for the police to arrive. The next few hours were a blur of police statements and hospital visits, and when I finally passed out, I collapsed on her couch. The Carters were arrested while attempting to leave the city, and their house of horrors was raided, exposing a sophisticated human trafficking operation that had been operating for years. As I sat in the police station wrapped in a shock blanket, Detective Johnson approached me and said, "You did good, Sarah." His voice was gruff but kind, and he thanked me for helping to put an end to one of the largest trafficking rings in the world. "State, you saved a lot of lives today." I nodded, too tired to talk, but I knew the memories would last a lifetime. In the days that followed, as I worked to put my life back together, I decided that I couldn't return to my previous job because I couldn't bear the idea of entering unfamiliar homes with strangers, but I could use my experience to help others. I began volunteering at a shelter for victims of human trafficking, sharing my story and giving hope to those who felt hopeless. The Carters had attempted to break me and turn me into a commodity, but in the end, they had only strengthened my resolve to fight back against them, against the system that permitted such evil to exist, and against the darkness that threatens to consume us all. I was no longer just Sarah Reeves, a real estate agent. I was a survivor, a fighter, and a beacon of hope for those who were still trapped. I knew I had made a terrible mistake when I saw the glint of metal in the driver's hand. It wasn't just a ride, it was a trap, and I had walked right into it. As the car sped down an unfamiliar road, my heart raced, and I had one thought that kept repeating in my head. How could I have been so foolish? It had begun innocently enough. I was hitchhiking across the country after graduating from college, and my backpack was lifting my spirits. Were high, and the open road seemed full of promise. I'd been lucky so far, meeting interesting people and seeing parts of America that I'd only dreamed about that fateful day. I'd been standing on the side of a quiet highway for hours, my thumb out, watching car after car zoom by, the sun setting and painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, when a blue sedan finally pulled over. The couple inside looked harmless enough. The man, who was probably in his late 40s, had a warm smile and crow's feet around his eyes, and the woman next to him was younger and had long. They identified themselves as Jack and Linda. "Where are you going, son?" Jack asked in a warm and inviting voice. "Wherever the road takes me," I replied. "Well, wherever the road takes me," and Linda laughed, a melodic sound. "Well, we're heading to Phoenix. Is that west enough for you?" I smiled, relieved that would be perfect, and thanked her. I threw my backpack in the trunk and got into the back seat. As we pulled away, I felt excited because this was what hitchhiking was all about, meeting new people and hearing their stories of kindness. For the first hour or so, we were strangers, and we talked easily about my travels, their lives in Phoenix, and the beauty of the surrounding landscape. Jack claimed to be a salesman, and Linda worked from home as a graphic designer. They had been married for 20 years and were high school sweethearts, but as the sky grew darker and the miles passed, something felt strange. I noticed Jack taking exits, and I was fairly certain that we weren't traveling to Phoenix. When I brought it up, Linda immediately shifted the conversation, asking about my family back home. An uncomfortable sensation settled in my stomach, so I took out my phone to see where we were. Of course, we were in the middle of nowhere, but everything was fine back there. Jack asked, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror, and I lied to keep my voice steady. I was just checking the time when Linda turned in her seat to face me, her smile no longer reaching her eyes. "You must be exhausted after all that walking." "Why?" I pretended to settle in and nodded, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I needed a plan, and when Jack reached to adjust the radio, his jacket shifted, revealing the gun holstered at his side. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. These people had ulterior motives, and I was positive they weren't good. I forced myself to remain composed, believing that jumping out of a moving car would be suicide, and I had to wait. For the scenery outside grew more barren as the hours went by, and we were deep in the desert. Red rocks and cacti had replaced the grasslands we had begun in, and Jack and Linda had become quiet, occasionally exchanging glances that made my skin crawl. Thankfully, at last, I saw the glowing lights of a gas station in the distance, and my heart leaped. This might be my chance. As we pulled up to the pump, I asked Jack if I needed to use the restroom, trying to sound casual. Narrowed a little, but he nodded. Sure, Linda, why don't you go with him? I'll fill up the tank. Come on, honey, let's freshen up. Linda's smile was so sweet and light that it felt like a vice as we walked towards the small convenience store. I looked around frantically for anyone who could help, but the station was empty except for a shabby-looking clerk, so I splashed water on my face and ran my mind, wondering if I could signal the clerk. But what if he was planning to use that gun? When we got back to the car, Jack was leaning against it, smoking a cigarette, and he asked with a sharp tone. I nodded, my mouth dry, as I reached for the handle of the back door. I saw my opportunity. My backpack was still in the trunk, so could I quickly grab something from it? Jack hesitated, then shrugged, so I walked to the back of the car, my heart racing, and as Jack opened the trunk, I took a deep breath, realizing that this was now or never. Fluid motion, I grabbed my backpack and swung it with all my might, and it hit Jack's head with a satisfying thud. He stumbled, caught off guard, and I didn't wait to see if he would fall. I ran, hearing Linda scream and Jack's angry shout, but I didn't turn around. I ran as if I had never run before, my feet pounding on asphalt and then on sand, and as I veered off the road into the desert, a gunshot rang out, the bullet whizzing past my ear. I continued running until my legs felt like jelly and my lungs burned. I was alone in the desert, miles from anywhere, with no water and no idea which way to go. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape started to wear off, leaving me shaky and terrified. I forced myself to think logically, forcing myself to think that the highway must be east of me. If I could find it, I could flag down a car and get help, but could I trust anyone after what had just happened? I started walking, using the stars to guide me through the desert night. It was chilly, and I shivered in my thin t-shirt. Every sound made me jump, including the rustle of a snake in the brush and the hoot of an owl above. I kept expecting to hear a car engine and see headlights cutting through the darkness, but nothing did. As the sky started to lighten, I heard something that made my heart hurt, the distant rumble of traffic. I quickened my pace, ignoring my sore feet and dry throat, and soon I could see it, the highway, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the desert. I stumbled onto the shoulder just as the sun was rising. When I saw a semi-truck in the distance, I frantically waved my arms, and to my great relief, it slowed and pulled over. The driver, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, looked at me and said, "You okay, kid? You look like you've been through hell." I almost started crying with relief, and I croaked my voice hoarse out of fear and thirst. I needed to help some people, but I couldn't finish the sentence because I didn't need to understand. He reached behind his seat and handed me a bottle of water. Jack and Linda weren't just providing a ride to a lone hitchhiker, they were predators searching for victims on the open road. How many others had fallen into their trap? How many hadn't been as fortunate as me? The police took my statement, their faces grim as I described my ordeal, and they informed me that Jack and Linda matched the description of a couple suspected in a string of disappearances across 3 states on dates. He said gently, "Then we'll call the cops, you're safe now." As I swallowed my breath, the truth of what I'd escaped began to sink in. As I gave more statements and tried to come to terms with what had happened, I couldn't help but feel that I had come dangerously close to becoming just another statistic. My carefree journey of self-discovery had turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. However, as I boarded a bus back home, my hitchhiking days firmly behind me, I realized something. I had survived. I had outsmarted them and outrun them. They had attempted to make me a victim, but the truth was that I had escaped and described. My journey of self-discovery wasn't over. It had just taken a turn I never would have predicted, but in the end, I had learned something crucial. My own strength, my will to survive, the open road still called to me. but now I knew its dangers as well as its beauty. I would travel again someday, but with my eyes wide open, aware that behind every friendly smile could lurk a hidden danger. The lesson I'd learned wasn't the one I had set out to learn, but it was one I would always carry with me. The creak of the cabin door made I had been alone in these woods for days, but as the handle slowly turned, I realized that my loneliness had been a delusion. Someone was here, and based on the metallic clicks and hushed whispers I heard outside, they weren't the friendly kind. It had all begun as a straightforward solo hiking trip, which I had been planning for months in an attempt to get away from the bustle of the city and re-establish a connection with nature. The Appalachian Trail seemed like the ideal challenge, beautiful, rugged, and just far enough away to provide the solitude I needed in the initial days. Were everything I had hoped for. I enjoyed the clear mountain air, the breathtaking views, and the deep silence that descended over the forest at night. My muscles hurt from the long days of hiking, but it was a good kind of pain that made me realize I was alive and pushing myself. On the fourth day, the weather changed and dark clouds brought with them a torrential downpour that showed no signs of stopping. I knew I had to find shelter quickly, and that's when I saw an old cabin half hidden among the when the rain stopped. I cautiously approached and called out a hello just in case someone was home. When no one answered, I tested the door and was surprised to find it swung open easily, the hinges creaking in protest. The cabin looked abandoned at first, its windows dark and the roof covered in a thick layer of moss, but it was sturdy, and most importantly, it was dry. The interior was musty but surprisingly well preserved, with a thick layer of dust covering everything but that there were a few old canned goods in the cupboards with faded but still readable labels, and a collection of dusty books lined a small shelf. Most of them field guides and local history. The furniture was intact, including a small table with 2 chairs, a pot-bellied stove in the corner, and a narrow bed against the far wall. It appeared as though whoever had lived here had simply left one day and never returned. As the day went on, it became evident that whoever had lived here had been a true outdoorsman. I made the most of the situation by getting a fire going in the stove, which drove away the damp chill. I also found an old deck of cards and played solitaire by candlelight that evening. It was almost cozy for the first time in days, and I felt truly relaxed. The sound of the rain on the roof and the crackle of the fire lulled me into a sense of security, and I went to sleep that night feeling secure and content. When I woke up the following morning, I discovered that the rain had stopped, but a dense fog had taken over. It was mid-afternoon when I first noticed something strange as I was rearranging my backpack. I could have sworn I saw movement outside the window, just a flicker in the mist, but as soon as I'd seen it, I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird, but then I heard it and a twig snapping followed. I decided to stay in the cabin for another day, thankful for the shelter, because visibility was poor and I knew it would be foolish to try to navigate the trail in these conditions. My heart started racing when I heard the distinct sound of hushed voices. I strained to see through the fog, and for a brief moment, nothing was there. Then, like ghosts, I saw 3 figures moving purposefully towards the cabin. Panic struck as I considered all the possible outcomes, each more terrifying than the last lost hikers. Rangers would announce that these people, whoever they were, didn't want to be seen, so I frantically searched for a place. When I heard them at the door, the creak of hinges, footsteps on the wooden floor, I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, pulling my backpack behind me. I just managed to close the hatch when I heard voices. "Someone's been here," a gruff male voice said, "Fire's still warm." Another voice, female this time, made sure they didn't just step out. I held my breath in fear. The cabin was small, with few options, under the bed too obvious, the cupboards too small, and my eyes landed on a hatch in the ceiling that I hadn't noticed before, an attic with shaking hands. I could see them moving around below, three of them, through gaps in the floorboards, and even the sound of my heartbeat might give me away. Just like I had seen outside, two men and a woman were all wearing dark clothing and carrying a bag. The second man said, "Hiker," and the woman hissed, "If they made it this far, we'll find them." The first man assured her that no one could stumble onto our operation and our boss would have our heads turned on. My mind was spinning, wondering what I had stumbled into, and they kept searching the cabin, going through my belongings. These weren't just criminals I'd stumbled upon, they were dangerous and they now saw me as a threat. The first man said, "We'll need to move everything because they couldn't risk her finding her way back here and bringing the cops." I watched helplessly as they went through my wallet and looked at my ID. "Sarah Jenkins," the woman read aloud, "got an address in Boston, far away from home, didn't you, Sarah?" I bit my lip to keep from making a sound. They talked about plans to search the surrounding area, and I stayed frozen in the barely daring to breathe. Hours passed, and at some point they left the cabin, but I was too scared to move, certain that they were still out there searching. As night fell, I heard them return, speaking in low voices, frustrated by their lack of success in finding the girl. Regarding the second man's question, there was a long pause, and my blood ran cold as I waited for the answer. I knew I couldn't stay in the attic forever because they would eventually think to look up here, or I would make a noise and give myself away if I tried to return in the middle of the night. However, the answer came to me as I listened to the sound of gentle snoring below. Two asleep and one awake. This was the best chance I had to get moving as quietly as possible, so I carefully opened the attic hatch. The cabin was dark, lit only by the faint glow of dying embers in the stove, figures on the bed, and a third silhouette by the window. I took a deep breath and told myself that it was now or never. I dropped from the attic landing as softly as possible. The figure by the window whirled around, but I was already on the move, so I grabbed the cast iron pan from the stove and swung with all my strength. There was a sickening thud, and the figure crumpled. The noise woke the others, but I was already at the door when I bounded out into the night, my legs pumping wildly as I ran blindly into the forest behind me. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit gave way to the typical nighttime noises of the forest, but I didn't stop because I couldn't risk it. As the first light of dawn started to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to slow down. I was exhausted and terrified, but I was alive, and the crash of underbrush as they gave chase. I ran like I'd never run before, ducking under branches and jumping over fallen logs. My legs screamed in protest, but fear kept me going. After several days of cautious travel, I eventually made it to a ranger station. The authorities initially didn't believe my story, but after a search of the area turned up evidence that supported it. The cabin had been cleared out, but there were still remnants of what the police described as a minor illegal operation. As I gave my statement and tried to process what had happened, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I had almost become just another statistic, another unexplained disappearance in the vast wilderness. As I boarded the bus back to Boston, I realized that my peaceful hiking trip had turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years to come. They had attempted to make me a victim, but instead they had made me a survivor, and the mountains still called to me with their beauty untarnished by my ordeal. I knew that I would return someday to complete the journey I had started, but this time I wouldn't be alone, and I would bring with me the knowledge that sometimes the greatest dangers we face aren't from. As I swerved off the road, my tires skidding on the wet asphalt, I had the thought that they had found me and they weren't going to let me escape this time. It had all begun 3 days prior when I was traveling cross-country from New York to Los Angeles for a fresh start following a messy divorce. After the truck veered towards me, I knew this was no accident. The murderous intent in the driver's eyes was evident even through the rain-streaked windshield. At a mundane gas station just outside of Omaha, I was filling up when I noticed two men arguing near the convenience store. It seemed heated, but I didn't give it much thought until I heard a gunshot. The next few moments were a blur. One man fell clutching his chest, the other looked around wildly, and his eyes locked with mine. I saw the gun in his hand, saw the panic and desperation on his face, and knew that I had become a witness to I saw the man running towards me in my rearview mirror as I jumped into my car, my hand shaking so badly that I could hardly get the key in the ignition. I drove like a woman possessed for the next few hours, constantly checking my mirrors, certain that I would see a car in pursuit at any moment. When I finally allowed myself to slow down, I realized the seriousness of my situation. I had witnessed a murder, and the killer had seen me. Was the only thing separating him from freedom. I considered calling the police, but I was afraid that they wouldn't believe me. What if the murderer had contacts? What if I were placed in protective custody? My fear-fueled paranoia from too many crime dramas made every possibility seem risky. So I continued driving through the night across 3 states, avoiding major highways and sticking to back roads and small towns. I paid for everything with cash and used fictitious names by the 3rd day. I was exhausted, and the constant vigilance, lack of sleep, and gnawing fear in my gut were all getting to be too much. I knew I couldn't continue this way indefinitely, so I decided to get help. At first, I didn't think much of the truck, just another car on the road. But as the miles passed, I noticed it was always there, a few cars back, never getting closer but never falling behind either. Was I imagining this? Lack of sleep made me jittery, so I took a random exit with my throat tight as I watched my rearview mirror and the truck followed. Panic struck, and I sped up, weaving through the light traffic on the county road. The truck continued to approach, and now that it was no longer trying to hide its pursuit, fat drops began to fall and splatter against my windshield. I turned on my wipers, and my knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. At that point, the truck made its move, pulling up alongside me, and I risked a glance over and saw my blood. The truck swerved towards me, metal screeching as it scraped along the side of my car. I jerked the wheel, desperately trying to keep control because we were on a bridge with concrete barriers on either side, leaving no room for error. Another vicious swerve from the truck sent me spinning, and I felt weightless as my car broke through. However, the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't the killer from the gas station. Training from a long-ago swimming class kicked in as the car started to sink. Wait for the car to fill with water. Then the pressure will equalize and you can open the door, but panic is a powerful thing. As the water rose past my chest, my seatbelt refused to unlatch, and I clawed at it. The barrier, then a sickening lurch as gravity took hold, turning the world outside my windows into a blur of gray sky and dark water as my car plummeted towards the river below. The impact knocked the wind out of me. As the car was completely submerged, the pressure inside equalized, and I was able to force the door open. I swam out, my lungs burning, my clothes dragging me down to the surface that seemed too far away, my vision beginning to darken around the edges, and just when I thought I could not hold on any longer, my head broke the surface and I gasped, sucking in great lungfuls of air. Every second felt like an eternity, and just as the water reached my chin, the belt finally gave way. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation set in. I was miles from anywhere, soaking wet, without a car or phone, and unsure of who was after me or why the killer from the gas station was so bad. I could see the bridge in the distance, the broken barrier where my car had gone through, and there was no sign of the truck or its driver. I made it to the shore, dragging myself out of the water on trembling limbs, and I collapsed on the muddy bank, coughing and shivering. Were there other people involved? This was bigger than I had thought, and I couldn't stay here because whoever had run me off the road would undoubtedly come looking to confirm my death. I forced myself to get up, protesting every movement, and I started walking downstream along the river, my wet clothes clinging to me and chafing with every step. The rain had stopped, but a cold wind had picked up, ripping through my sodden jacket. So I clung to the trees along the riverbank for protection, jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves to keep myself warm while ignoring the tremors that tore through my body as night fell. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Who were these people? Why were they so desperate to silence me? And what had I stumbled into? After what seemed like hours of walking, I noticed lights in the distance, a small town nestled in the valley civilization, and with it the promise of assistance, but also the threat of discovery. I approached carefully, staying on shadows. The town was small, with only a main street and a few houses and businesses. A diner on the corner was still open, and warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk. My stomach rumbled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten in almost a day, but food would have to wait. I needed information and a way out of here, so I focused on the local library, a small building across the street. It wasn't much, but it was a start, because breaking in was easier than I had anticipated due to small towns and their trusting nature. The window latch was weak and gave way easily, so I slipped inside and prayed that there was no alarm system. The front desk computer was old, but it worked, so I googled the gas station where this had all occurred to see if there had been any news of a shooting, but there was nothing. It seemed as though it had never happened. I then expanded my search to look for any recent crimes or suspicious activity in the area, and in the process I came across a brief article about a series of unexplained disappearances along the I-80 corridor, mostly truckers. Headlights swept across the window as a car drove by slowly, too slowly, and I ducked down, my heart pounding. The police had no leads, but locals whispered about a shadowy organization, a modern-day highway pirates preying on unsuspecting travelers. My blood ran cold as I read this. Had I discovered something more serious than a simple murder? Had they already found me? I waited for what seemed like an eternity, barely breathing, until I finally dared to. I knew my ordeal was far from over as I slipped out of the library and into the night. I was way over my head, caught up in something I didn't understand, but I was alive, and as long as I was breathing, I had a chance. I started walking again, this time with purpose. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. They were out there watching, waiting, and I was determined to stay one step ahead no matter what. When I walked into the unknown, one thought kept me going. I would find the truth and I would make them pay. They had tried to kill me, but they had only made me stronger, and now I was coming for them. The first video file I opened showed a man being tortured, and the second revealed a drug deal gone wrong by the authorities. Out in front of me, it was dark and full of unknowns, but for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt a glimmer of hope. Third, as I looked at the car parked across the street, I realized that the laptop I had purchased wasn't just used. It was proof of something much more sinister. For me, it all began innocently enough when my old laptop finally died after years of devoted service. Since I work as a freelance graphic designer and couldn't afford to be without a computer for very long, I turned to Craigslist in the hopes of finding a good used computer that wouldn't break the bank, which is how I met Derek's ad. When I got to the coffee shop to meet him, I saw a nervous-looking man in his 30s fidgeting with his coffee cup. "You must be Alex," he said, forcing a smile. "Here's the laptop, it's all yours." I quickly checked it over and it appeared to be in good condition, and when I booted it up, everything seemed to work fine. I handed over the cash and Derek practically ran out of the cafe at that point. I chalked it up to social awkwardness. I spent the evening installing software, moving files, and setting up my new purchase. It was almost midnight when I discovered the hidden folder, which was hidden deep in the system files under the innocent name backup data. Curiosity got the better of me and I clicked, but what I saw made my blood run cold. There were hundreds of video files with titles like Warehouse Pickups 03 and Johnson's Interrogation, and as my finger hovered over the mouse, a voice in my head pleaded with me not to open them, but I had to know because the first video began to play. A man was strapped to a chair, bloodied and bruised, and someone was asking questions with a distorted voice. When the man refused to answer, his fingernail was carefully pulled off with pliers, and his screams would haunt my nightmares for weeks. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. What had I gotten myself into? Who was Derek, really? More importantly, who were the people in these videos? That night, I tossed and turned, wondering what I should do. Call the police? I spent the day going through the files, being careful not to open any more videos because the level of organization I'd seen in those files suggested this wasn't some small-time operation. There were documents, ledgers, shipping manifests, and what appeared to be coded messages. It was obvious I'd stumbled upon something big and dangerous. As evening approached, I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked across the street. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. There has been nothing but the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I looked out the blinds, and my heart almost stopped when I saw a man sitting in the driver's seat, staring straight at my apartment. Panic struck because they knew they had somehow tracked the laptop to me. My mind raced with all the possible outcomes, including Derek selling me out and the laptop being tracked. I reached for my phone, ready to dial 911, but I stopped short because I wasn't sure who I could trust if this organization was as large as I thought. They could have people everywhere. A plan started to take shape, but I couldn't. It was obvious that I couldn't just leave, but I also knew that I had a duty to expose whatever it was, so I hastily packed a bag, put some money in it, and put away some basic toiletries. Then I considered the laptop, which I couldn't risk taking with me, but I couldn't leave it behind either, so I took out the hard drive, put it in my bag, and then, in a flash of inspiration, replaced it with the drive from my old laptop so that anyone checking would think it was just a regular computer. When I heard a deep voice say, "We need to speak with you about a recent purchase you made," I chose not to answer and instead made my way quietly to the fire escape outside my bedroom window. As I descended, I heard my front door break down, my feet hit the alley pavement, and I started running. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop the sound of shouts behind me, which encouraged me to keep going. I ran for what seemed like hours, taking random turns and doubling back. Finally, exhausted and breathless, I ducked into a 24-hour diner. The waitress gave me a strange look as I slid into a booth, but I remained silent. I ordered coffee with trembling hands and took out my phone. I needed help, but who could I trust? Then it occurred to me that Sarah, my ex-girlfriend, was the person who could help me make sense of this and get the information to the right people. I dialed her number in the hopes that she would answer despite the "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I need your help." I said in a low voice, "I'm in trouble, big trouble, and I think I've uncovered something huge." There was a pause. "Are you drunk?" I asked, "Can you meet me, please?" I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. She must have heard the desperation in my voice. "Okay? Where are you?" she asked, and I gave her the address of the diner before hanging up. As I waited, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched by everyone. Sarah showed up about 20 minutes later, looking worried and a little irritated. "All right, Alex," she said, slithering into the booth across from me. "What's going on?" And I took a deep breath before telling her everything. Her expression changed from skepticism to shock and then to a grim determination I recognized from our days together. When I finished, I took out my laptop and booted it up, and her eyes widened as I described the situation. My mouth went dry as I opened file after file that showed the extent of what I had found. Alex said slowly, "Do you realize what this is? This isn't just some criminal organization. This is evidence of corruption at the highest levels. Politicians, police chiefs, judges, they're all implicated in these files." Sarah thought for a moment. "We can't go to the police just yet. We need to verify this information, find corroborating evidence, and we need to keep you safe." She took out her own laptop and started typing frantically. "I'm emailing my editor." Where she worked, I looked out the window and my heart almost stopped. The dark sedan from earlier was pulling into the parking lot, and I hissed, "We need to go." She looked up, saw my expression, and nodded. We hurriedly packed up our belongings and made our way to the back exit as we slipped out into the night. I heard shouts behind us. "They've found us and my car," and Sarah grabbed my hand as we ran through alleyways and side streets, with the sound of pursuit never far behind us until we arrived at our car. When we pulled out of the parking space in an old but dependable Honda Civic, I noticed two men around the corner, their faces twisted with rage. "Where are we going?" I asked, and Sarah said, "I have a cabin upstate," keeping her eyes on the road. "It's off the grid. We'll be safe there while we figure this out." As the city lights went out behind us and the highway stretched out ahead, I felt a mixture of excitement and fear. In just one day, my life had been completely upended, and I was a fugitive escaping evil forces. Didn't fully understand, but I wasn't alone, and for the first time since it all started, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever I'd stumbled into, whatever dangers lay ahead, I knew one thing for sure: the truth would come out. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I silently vowed that I would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. The laptop I'd bought on a whim had thrown me into a dangerous and intriguing world, but it had also given me a purpose, and I was determined to see it through to the end. Ultimately, the first shadow I saw might have been a trick of the light, and the second might have been my imagination running wild, but when I heard the whispers coming from behind the walls, I knew with a chilling certainty that I wasn't alone in this expansive haunted mansion, and whatever was inside of me wasn't human. I had taken the job as an overnight caretaker at Ravencrest Manor out of desperation, fresh out of college with a mountain of student debt and no promising job prospects. The advertisement had seemed like a godsend. A historic mansion was looking for a live-in. The owner, a reclusive elderly woman named Mrs. Blackwood, spoke to me through thick glasses, her eyes magnified to an unsettling degree. "You're not afraid of the dark, are you, dear?" she asked in a raspy, thin voice, and I laughed nervously. "No, ma'am, not at all," she nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good, you'll need a strong constitution for this job. The nights can be long at night," she said. All of this seemed too good to be true. My first night at Ravencrest had been uneventful, if a little eerie. The mansion was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity with more rooms than I could count. My duties were simple: patrol the halls, make sure all doors and windows were locked, and report any disturbances. I assumed that things would start to get strange on my third night, but I should have heeded her warning, because the promise of a paycheck and a roof over my head had outweighed any reservations. I froze my flashlight beam, trembling as I pointed it at the closed door after hearing a melodic humming coming from one of the unused bedrooms. The humming stopped abruptly, and I said, "Hello," my voice echoing in the empty hallway. "Is someone there?" Then, just as I thought I had imagined it, a high-pitched, childlike giggle sent shivers down my spine. I approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. It felt cold to the touch. I took a deep breath and pushed it open, and the room was empty under the moonlight. As the nights went on, it became more difficult to explain the incidents because things would move when I wasn't looking. Doors I'd sworn I'd locked would be wide open on my next pass, and there was always the feeling of being watched. Moths were floating in the air, streaming through the large windows, and there was a small handprint in the dust on the floor, a child's handprint. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding, thinking this had to be some sort of prank. Perhaps the day staff were hazing the new girl. I was in the mansion's enormous library on my 7th night, reshelving some books that had somehow fallen to the floor. As I reached up to put a heavy tome on the top shelf, I felt something brush against my leg. I looked down, thinking I might see a mouse or one of the many stray cats that live there, but instead I saw a small, pale hand reach out from behind a bookcase. I staggered back, and the hand retreated, and I heard the same childlike giggle from earlier. His time accompanied by the patter of little feet running away. "This isn't funny," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. "Whoever's doing this, come out now." The only answer I got was the creaking of the old house settling. I ran out of the library, not caring about my job or my duties, just wanting to get out. However, as I got to the main foyer, I saw something that stopped me cold. Mrs. Blackwood, but she didn't look like the woman I'd seen before. Her hair was black instead of gray, her posture was straight. And the young and desperate have always been drawn to Ravencrest because it feeds on their fear and vitality. As she asked, more figures started to appear, including children dressed in vintage clothing, a man in a butler's uniform with a gaping wound in his chest, a woman in a maid's uniform, and a woman in a maid's uniform. "Regal was leaving so soon, my dear?" Her voice was echoing strangely in the cavernous space. "What's going on here?" I demanded, not tremor in my voice. "We are the guardians of Ravencrest, and now, my dear, are you?" I turned and ran, yanking at the front door, which wouldn't budge behind me. I could hear them approaching, their whispers growing louder in desperation. I grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and smashed it against the nearest window, breaking the glass and ignoring the cuts and scrapes as I did so. Her neck was bent at an impossible angle, and I whispered, "What are you?" Mrs. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing too many teeth. When I fell onto the overgrown lawn, I didn't dare turn around and continued running into the night. I didn't stop until I got to the main road, where a passing trucker felt sorry for me and gave me a ride into town. I went to the police and, of course, told them everything. They listened to me politely and told me that Ravencrest Manor had burned down in 1954 and that all that was left was an empty, overgrown lot. I didn't believe them, and the following day I drove back out to the mansion, determined to show that I wasn't crazy. But there it was, just as I felt a chill go down my spine as I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing and what I knew I had experienced. The police had described a large, empty lot that was overgrown with weeds and scattered with the charred remnants of a long-gone fire. There was a glint of something metallic in the tall grass, and I approached cautiously, my heart in my throat. It was the candlestick, the one I had used to break the window, and it lay there unquestionably, an unquestionable piece of evidence from a place that supposedly didn't exist. I never returned to Ravencrest. I moved out of state, changed my name, and did everything I could to put that night behind me, but occasionally late at night I still hear the whispers and see the shadow moving in the corners of my vision. I was too scared to touch it, so I left it there as I drove away. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the mansion standing tall and imposing against the sky, and in an upstairs window, a pale face watched me go. The job offer for its newest caretaker is still occasionally posted in small local newspapers or on obscure websites. Historic mansion is looking for a live-in caretaker for night shifts with excellent pay, and I know that somewhere else, another desperate soul is seeing it and thinking it's the answer to their prayers. I want to warn them to run away from Raven Crest and its hungry ghosts, but who would believe me? The experience at Raven Crest changed me. I no longer see the world the way I once did. Every old building has secrets, every shadow could conceal something unexplainable. And I've turned into a collector of strange stories and a seeker of the unexplained because I know now that the dark isn't empty. I remain silent, watch and wait, checking my doors and windows every night and leaving a light on because I know that sometimes if you look too long into the shadows, they start looking back. Even though it was terrifying, it was also thrilling because it was real in a way that nothing in my life has been since. However, then I remember Mrs. Blackwood's smile, which was too wide and too sharp, and the cold touch of spectral hands, and I know that some doors once opened can never truly be closed again, so I stay. There is more to our world than most people realize, and sometimes late at night when the wind howls and the house creaks, I find myself missing the long corridors of Raven Crest for the whispers in the walls and the giggle of ghostly children. Away, and I do my best to warn others, but I know that Raven Crest will call me back someday, and when it does, I'm not sure if I'll be able to withstand its allure because once you've seen the other side, the ordinary world never feels like home again. The moment I saw the town's residents' eyes, I knew we had driven into something much worse than a simple pit stop. There was a void in their stares, a hollow that made me shiver. As my wife asked for directions, I became increasingly horrified to discover that we had not located assistance. We had fallen into a trap. It began as a typical road trip. Sarah and I were traveling cross-country to her parents' house for Thanksgiving. We had made this trip a dozen times before, but this year we chose a picturesque route in the hopes of seeing some of the charming small towns that dot the American landscape. That choice would turn out to be a grave mistake. We were somewhere in the Midwest, surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat, when our car began to make a menacing clanking sound. I'm not a mechanic. We limped for a few more miles before the engine completely died, leaving us stranded on a desolate stretch of highway as the sun began to set. Sarah said, looking at her phone, "There must be a town nearby, but I'm not getting any signal out here." I nodded, trying to hide my growing uneasiness. A few miles back, we passed a sign that said, I think it said "Can't be too far, Silver Creek." We packed what we could carry and began to walk. The November air was crisp, and a light fog had started to roll in. Silver Creek emerged from the mist like a mirage, a small cluster of buildings that looked like they hadn't changed much since the 1950s. The town was eerily quiet for an early evening, with no cars on the streets, no people walking about, and most of the storefronts dark. After what seemed like hours, we saw lights in the distance, but everything was still silent as we walked. No crickets, no rustling of small animals in the grass, just our footsteps and the occasional gust of wind. As we got closer to the diner, Sarah said, "Thank God, maybe they have a phone we can use." The neon open sign flickered erratically, and I could see some customers sitting strangely still in their booths through the windows. The bell above the door jangled as we walked in. The noise was unbelievably loud in the quiet diner, and everyone turned to stare at us. Their eyes were glassy, as if something were wrong with them. Unfocused like those of a taxidermy animal, "Hi," Sarah said, her voice trembling a little. "Our car broke down a few miles back. Could we use your phone to call a tow truck?" For a long moment, nobody spoke or moved, and then, as if someone had flipped a switch, everyone smiled. It wasn't a friendly or welcoming smile, though. It was mechanically practiced, as if they were trying to remember how smiling worked. A waitress came up to greet us, her movements rigid and jerky, and she said, "We don't get many visitors." The waitress went on as if she hadn't heard me. "You must be tired from your journey. Why don't you sit down and have some pie? Our cherry pie is famous in these parts." Before we could object, She led us into a booth, and the other customers were still staring and grinning those unsettling smiles. I tried not to tremble as I said, "We appreciate the hospitality, but we really need to get going if we could." As if on cue, a man came out of the kitchen with 2 plates of cherry pie and placed them down in front of us with robotic precision. Sarah and I exchanged glances, but something was really wrong here. "It's getting late," Sarah said in a tight, forced cheerful voice. "We should really find a place to stay for the night. Is there a motel in town?" The waitress' smile was interrupted by her smile, which never wavered. "Just use your phone now." Widening, revealing too many teeth, she said, "Oh, we have plenty of room for you here at Silver Creek. We always have room for new residents." Her words "residents" sent a shiver down my spine. I got up and grabbed Sarah's hand, saying, "Thanks for the offer, but we'll be going." As we approached the door, the other patrons stood up in unison, forming a wall between us and the exit. Their faces were still fixed in those eerie smiles, so you haven't even tried the pie I looked at. Looking around desperately for another way out of the kitchen, I whispered to Sarah, "If we could just get through there, maybe we could find a back door run." Then, louder, "Look, a UFO." It was a desperate ploy, but for a split second, it worked. We ran for the kitchen, pushing past the shock cook behind us. I could hear chairs scraping against the floor as our pursuers pursued us. The kitchen was a maze of stainless steel and hanging utensils, so we had to avoid them. Just as I had hoped, there were prep tables and vats of bubbling liquid at the back. I slammed my shoulder into the exit door, and we exploded into the cool night air. However, our relief was fleeting, as the entire town appeared to have awakened. Figures were coming out of every building, all heading in our direction, using that same strange gait. Sarah hissed, drawing me to a narrow alley between 2 buildings where we ran with our feet pounding on the pavement, and the sound of pursuit grew louder behind us. Opened up onto another street, but it was useless because they were closing in from all sides. Their faces were the same, now emotionless, and their eyes were frighteningly vacant. "What do they want?" Sarah gasped as we retreated against a wall. As if in response, the crowd dispersed and a figure appeared. It was an elderly man with a hunched back and a heavy cane. Unlike the others, his eyes were alert and sharp. "We've been waiting for you," he said in a surprisingly strong voice. "What do you want from us?" I asked, and the old man laughed with a dry, rattling sound. "Silver Creek has always been here waiting for lost souls like yourselves. We need new blood, you see, new minds to join our community." As he was speaking, I noticed something strange. The people of the other town were changing. Their skin was becoming translucent, their features blurring. They looked less and less human with each second that went by. "You're not really people, are you?" Sarah whispered in horror dawning on her face, and the old man's smile grew incredibly. "Changed us, made us better, and now it's your turn." He raised his cane and the crowd rushed forward. I felt cold hands grab at me and pull me down. Sarah's scream was cut short as she was engulfed by the mass of non-human bodies. I fought, clawed, and kicked, but there were too many, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. Before I knew how long I had been unconscious, I was lying in a bed in what appeared to be a charming country inn. Through the window, I could see the sun rising over Silver Creek, which now looked like a perfect small town straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. For a moment, I thought it had all been a horrible dream, but then I saw my reflection in the mirror across the room. My eyes were different, glassy, and unfocused like those of a taxidermy animal. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate, instead curving into a wide, unnatural smile. When I saw my motorcycle disappear around the corner, I realized I had made a terrible decision. The sick feeling in my stomach wasn't just about losing my prized possession, it was the terrifying realization that I had invited a predator into my life, and now he knew exactly where I lived. Sarah and I would be welcoming the next lost travelers who stumbled into our little slice of Americana. Welcome to Silver Creek, where everyone smiles and no one ever leaves. It had started innocently enough, so I decided to sell the decision to buy a beloved Harley-Davidson was made more out of need than desire. The bike had accompanied me on many road trips and late-night rides, but growing expenses and a recent layoff meant that compromises had to be made. I put up an online ad with pictures and a thorough description, and within hours I got a message from a man named Mike. He seemed sincere and asked insightful questions about the bike's maintenance and history, so we set up a meeting for the following day so he could have a look. Mike asked, his hand resting on the handlebar just around the block, to get a feel for her. I hesitated. It wasn't an unusual request when buying a bike, but something in my gut tingled, so I pushed it aside, blaming it on S's nerves. He looked like a seasoned rider, complete with leather jacket, well-worn boots, and a knowledgeable glint in his eye as he circled the bike. We talked easily about motorcycles on the open road for a while, and I even felt a pang of regret about selling my mind if I did. Mike's face broke into a broad smile as he swung his leg over the seat. The engine roared to life, and he gave me a brief salute before pulling away from the curb. I watched as he rounded the corner at the end of my street, and as the sound of the engine faded, I waited for it to grow loud again as he finished the block, but it never did. The minutes passed, and each one got longer than the last, and I felt sick. I took out my phone, anticipating a call. My blood ran cold when I saw a notification from Mike saying, "Thanks for the bike, sucker, better lock your doors tonight." I rushed inside, my hands shaking, locking every window and door as my mind raced with questions about how I could have been so foolish. I had invited this man to my house, shown him where I lived, and now he had my bike, and it appeared that he had plans to return for more. The police were understanding but not very helpful. They took my statement but did not use the bike's GPS tracker, which I had foolishly. I couldn't bring myself to leave. This was my home, and damned if I was going to let some thief scare me out of it. But as night fell, every sound became magnified. The creak of the house settling sounded like footsteps. The rustle of leaves outside my window became whispered threats, and they didn't have much to go on when I decided to sell. They promised to keep an eye out and suggested that I stay with a friend for a few days, possible at 2 a.m. As I looked through the blinds, I heard the low rumble of a motorcycle engine getting louder. At the end of my driveway, I saw my Harley and a figure I thought was Mike sitting there for what seemed like hours, his face hidden behind a helmet, taunting me and planning his next move. I considered calling the police again, but I was afraid of what might happen while they were there. Eventually, the figure revved the engine and sped off into the night. I let out a breath. Didn't realize I'd been holding, but my relief was fleeting because I knew this was far from over. The following day, I was a wreck, exhausted and irritable from fear and exhaustion. I called in sick to my new job, unable to concentrate on anything but the threat looming over me as I made another pot of coffee. My phone buzzed again, this time from Mike, saying, "Miss me, don't worry, I'll be back maybe tonight, maybe not, sweet dreams." I couldn't live like this, jumping at shadows, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I had to take action. As darkness descended, I positioned myself in the living room with the lights off, the hours slipping by as each car passed on the street, making my heart race. Just as my vigilance started to wane, I heard the sound of my bike approaching slowly. I had dug out the old baseball bat from my college days and kept it close. I had also placed makeshift alarms on all the doors and windows, and empty cans balanced precariously, ready to clatter to the ground at the slightest disturbance. I heard footsteps on my front porch, the doorknob rattled twice, and then there was silence. I gripped the bat tighter, my palms slick with sweat, but nothing happened for a long time. The answer came in the form of breaking glass, and he was coming through the window. I didn't think I acted as a dark figure climbed through the broken window. I swung the bat with all my might, and there was a satisfying thunk and a cry of pain. The intruder stumbled, and I swung again, catching him. Despite my best efforts, he spat blood onto my carpet. "It doesn't matter, your buddy Mike owed me. He said I could have the bike to settle his debt. I figured I'd see what else you had worth taking." He went down hard in the ribs, swearing and gasping for air. I fumbled for the lights, that still raised defensively in the sudden brightness. I got my first clear look at my tormentor, and it wasn't Mike. He was older, his face scarred and weathered, and he glared up at me with a mixture of pain and rage. A neighbor, awakened by the commotion, had called the police, and as the patrol car pulled up outside, a wave of relief washed over me. The aftermath was a blur of police statements and insurance claims, and the man who broke in had a long history of similar crimes. He was sent back to prison for a long time. Mike, the supposed buyer, had set me up and used me to pay off his debts, knowing full well what kind of person he was sending my way. The sound of sirens broke through the night. I sold it for real this time to a dealer, and the proceeds went toward a security system for my home cameras and motion sensors. Some might call it paranoia, but to me it was a small price to pay for peace of mind. Weeks went by, and gradually things started to return to normal, but as I stood there, I felt none of the joy or excitement it had once brought me. All I could think about was the fear the violation had caused. When I saw a man leaning against a motorcycle in the parking lot one day as I was leaving work, my heart raced and my old fears came flooding back, but as I got closer, I realized it was just a coworker admiring his new bike when he called out, "Hey, wanna go for a ride?" I hesitated. The old me would have jumped at the chance, but maybe another time, I said, forcing a smile as I hurried to my car and drove home. Feeling of loss, not only of my bike, but of the person I used to be, who saw the best in people who embraced adventure fearlessly. That night, as I sat on my porch and looked out at the quiet street, a motorcycle roared by. The sound was so exciting that it sent a chill down my spine. I wondered if I would ever experience that thrill again, or if fear would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. However, as I watched the bike fade into the distance, I made the decision that I couldn't allow one negative experience to haunt me. The following day, I asked my coworker about his bike, and when he offered to take me for a ride again, I took a deep breath and said yes. As we drove down the open road, the wind blowing in my face and the engine rumbling beneath me, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The fear was still there, a murmur in the back of my mind, but it no longer controlled me. I had faced my worst fears and emerged from the experience changed, yes, but unbroken, and as the miles passed, I realized that sometimes the only way to overcome fear is the open road was calling to me once more, and this time I was prepared to answer. However, as soon as we heard the first scream reverberating through the cave system, I realized that our weekend getaway had turned into a battle for survival. What we would find in the depths of those caverns would haunt us for the rest of our lives if we survived. My friends Jake, Lisa, and Mia and I had been organizing this hike for months. We were all seasoned outdoor enthusiasts, but none of us had the local legends surrounding the Shadow Mayor cave system had always captivated us, and we had laughed them off as campfire stories meant to frighten tourists. However, the hike to the cave entrance was uneventful, full of the typical banter and excitement of friends on an adventure. The weather was perfect, with warm sunlight filtering through the dense forest canopy as we approached the main cavern's yawning mouth, along with a cool breeze. Jake's voice was tinged with a mixture of excitement and trepidation as he said, "This is it. Shadow Mayor Cave's last chance to back out." Lisa rolled her eyes and said, "Don't tell me you're buying into those silly ghost stories, Jake." "Of course not." He responded a little too quickly, saying, "It's not too late to hit that brewery in town instead." Mia pulled out her headlamp, saying, "No way, we didn't come all this way to chicken out. Come on, let's go." I nodded in agreement, ignoring the slight twinge of the first hour in the caves was amazing, with enormous chambers opening up before us, their walls glittering with mineral deposits that caught the light of our headlamps. We carefully picked our way through narrow passages, marveling at the strange rock formations shaped by millennia of flowing water. However, when we reached a fork in the passage, things started to feel off our map. I was uneasy because we had brought maps, extra batteries, first aid kits, and everything we needed for a safe spelunking adventure. Showed only one path, but there were two identical tunnels extending into the darkness. That's strange, I muttered, double-checking the map. Jake pied down both passages, but there is no marking on the map. Perhaps the old cave systems on the map can change over time. Lisa nodded, so we debated for a few minutes before choosing the left tunnel, which appeared to slope gently upward, which we hoped would eventually lead us back to the surface. As we descended farther, the air became noticeably colder, and we caught our breath. We all paused and sniffed the air, and it was a musty odor with an underlying sweetness that was somehow worse. Jake said that it was probably just some strange fungus, but he didn't seem convinced. The walls of this tunnel were different too, smoother, almost polished in places, and there was something else, a faint smell I couldn't quite place. Does anyone else smell that? Mia asked, voicing my thoughts. I found myself shivering despite the exertion of the hike. We were crossing this chamber when we heard a scream that was far away but unmistakable, echoing through the cave. We froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks of disbelief and fear. What the hell was Lisa whispering? Mia suggested that it might have been the wind, but we all knew that the scream had been human, so we should turn around right away. Jake said, "We should go back." And I was about to agree when we heard it again, closer this time, but it wasn't a scream of before we could react. Figures appeared from the shadows at the chamber's edges. They moved unusually quickly, and Grace was closing in on us from all sides. In the light from my headlamp, I saw glimpses of pale, nearly translucent skin and eyes that reflected the light like a cat's run. I yelled, grabbing Mia's arm and dragging her back to the tunnel we had come from. The sound of pursuit was close behind us, and the tunnel's smooth walls now appeared malevolent, as if the cave itself was. We skittered around a corner and came to a dead end that had never been there before. Lisa gasped, "This is impossible. We came this way," but there was no time to figure it out because our pursuers were approaching. We pressed against the wall in a desperate attempt to find an escape route when I noticed a narrow crack in the rock face that was barely visible in the shadows. I shouted, "We can squeeze through one by one," and we forced ourselves into the crevice, which was a tight fit due to the rough stone scraping. As we crept forward, I went last, and as I pulled my legs in, I felt something grab at my ankle. I kicked out blindly, hearing a hiss of pain, and I scrambled deeper into the crack. We came to a smaller chamber than the last, but there were several tunnels branching off in different directions. Without talking about it, we chose one at random, and after what seemed like hours of frantic flight, we finally stopped to catch our breath. We were lost and hunted in a system of caves that seemed to defy logic and the laws of nature. Our map was useless, our supplies were running low, and our chances of finding our way out were getting slimmer by the minute as we huddled together trying to decide our next move. Had faded, but the oppressive silence that replaced it was almost worse. What were those things? Mia panted. Her face was pale in the glow of our headlamps. Nobody had an answer. Jake said, "Come, we must move immediately." But as we turned to run again, we saw the pale figures obstructing our escape. Their eyes shone in the darkness, and they were humanoid, but with elongated limbs and fingers that ended in wicked claws. Their mouths were filled with needle-sharp teeth bared in feral grins, and we were trapped. Just when I thought this was it, a new sound filled the cave, a high-pitched keening wail. The creatures around us recoiled, hiding what appeared to be there. A battle unlike anything I had ever seen or could have imagined ensued. The pale, feral creatures fought with savage ferocity, but they were no match for the glowing beings and their light weapons. In a matter of minutes, it was over, and one of the glowing figures came up close to us. Through my squinted eyes, I saw new figures entering the fray. They were tall, willowy beings that seemed to glow from within, and in their hands, they held weapons that appeared to be made of pure light. Its face was hauntingly beautiful, with features that seemed to change and evolve as I looked at them. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice echoing in my mind instead of my ears. "This place is not for your kind. We got lost." I managed to stammer, "Please, we just want to go home." The being looked at us silently for a moment before nodding. "We'll guide you to the surface, but you must never return, and you must never speak of what you've seen here in a daze." We never discussed what happened in those caves, not even among ourselves, but occasionally in the dead of night I still hear those inhuman screams echoing in my dreams, and I wonder about the war raging beneath our feet in a world we were never meant to see. The trip through the tunnels went by quickly, and before I knew it, we were staggering out into the sunlight, blinking and confused. When we turned around, the cave entrance was gone, replaced by a solid rock face as if it had never existed. The first flicker of the headlights in our rearview mirror made me feel relieved. The second made me uneasy, and the third, as they grew larger and brighter, I knew with chilling certainty that whoever was behind us wasn't here to help. They were hunting us. I'll be the first to recommend that brewery instead someday, because I've learned that the depths are better left unplumbed and the mysteries of the underground will remain just that, mysteries, and perhaps that's for the best. We had been driving for hours when I noticed a sign for a shortcut. Willow Creek Road 30 miles shorter to Millbrook. It was written in faded letters, and Sarah gave me a doubtful look. "Are you sure about this, Dan? It's getting dark and we don't know the area." I dismissed her worries, saying that it would be okay, that we would save an hour at the very least, and that it would be an adventure as Emily and Max, our two children, were getting restless in the back seat. Initially, the road appeared to be fine, perhaps with more twists and turns than I had anticipated, but nothing our SUV couldn't handle. However, as we continued into the forest, with trees pressing in on either side, I started to have second thoughts. The road narrowed, changing from asphalt to gravel, and then to little more than a dirt track, and our headlights cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating a path that seemed to grow. I was about to agree when our engine made a sputtering, coughing noise that I knew all too well meant trouble. I muttered, easing off the gas, but it was too late. The engine gave one last violent shudder and died, leaving us coasting to a stop in the middle of nowhere. For a moment, we sat in stunned silence, the sudden quiet broken only by the soft voice of Sarah. "Dan, I really think we should turn back with each passing mile." Daddy Max's little voice came from the back seat, asking why we stopped. I turned to my family and tried to remain calm, saying, "It's okay, buddy. The car is just having a little problem. We'll figure it out." However, as I went outside to check under the hood, I realized we were in serious trouble, because even though I'm not a mechanic, I could see that this was beyond my ability to fix, and we were stranded. I took out my phone, knowing that there would be no signal, and Sarah joined me outside, her face pale in the fading light. She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both knew that morning was far off, so we tried our best to make the kids comfortable by turning the back of the SUV into a makeshift bed as they fell asleep. And Sarah and I sat in the front talking quietly about our options. Like, what are we going to do, Dan? I took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. Okay, we have some food and water in the cooler blankets in the trunk, and we'll be fine for the night. The first flicker of light in the distance gave me hope that there would be another car that could help us. But as the lights got closer, that hope turned to anxiety. The car was driving erratically, speeding up and slowing down, its headlights sweeping across the road as if looking for something or someone. Dan, Sarah whispered, "Something's not right," gripping my arm. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry, waking the kids quietly. "We need to get out of the car." Sarah woke Emily and Max. We had just reached the tree line when the other vehicle appeared. It was a battered pickup truck with a roaring engine that was approaching our stranded SUV. From where we were hiding, we watched as two men got out. Even in the dim light, I could see that they were rough-looking characters, the kind you'd cross the street to avoid in the city. "Check the car." One of them barked. They couldn't have gone very far, my heart. Emergency backpack from the trunk, flashlight, first aid kit, snacks, and a bottle of water. Max whimpered softly, and I clamped my hand over his mouth, praying that the men wouldn't hear him as they searched our car. Their irate cries were getting louder by the second, and I knew that we couldn't stay here any longer. We had to move, so I whispered to Sarah, "Deeper into the forest," and she nodded, her face wearing a mask of fear and resolve. Taking Emily's hand, she started to lead the way into the darkness, and I followed, Max constantly looking. After what seemed like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we stopped in a small clearing. The kids were tired, their faces strewn with tears, and Emily whispered, "Mommy, I'm scared." Sarah pulled her close, knowing that we were safe. Over my shoulder, we staggered through the underbrush, trying to be as quiet as possible while putting distance between us and the road. The forest was alive with night sounds, such as the hoot of an owl and the rustle of small animals in the leaf litter. "However, we're gonna be all right, Daddy, and I won't allow anything to happen to you." I wish I had been more confident, but the truth was that I was terrified that we were lost in a strange forest being hunted by men whose intentions I didn't want to imagine, and that I had no idea how to get us out of it. A branch suddenly breaking nearby made us all freeze, so I motioned for Sarah to take the kids and hide behind a fallen log while I huddled behind a tree, my heart in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't believe that these men hadn't chased us into the forest in the middle of the night just to talk. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, swinging back and forth as heavy footsteps approached. I held my breath, praying that the kids would keep quiet. "I knew you were out here." A gruff voice called out, "Make it easy on yourselves and come on out. We just want to talk." As the footsteps got closer, I could see the man, whose face was partially illuminated by his flashlight. He was large, had a scraggly beard, and had eyes that, searching back and forth, he was going to find us. It was only a matter of time. I took a deep breath, picked up a rock, and threw it as far as I could in the opposite direction. It clattered against a tree, making the sound abnormally loud in the quiet forest. The man's head snapped towards the noise. "Got you now," he muttered, and started to leave us. As soon as he was out of sight, I hurried to Sarah and the children, saying, "We must keep moving." Sarah nodded, her face going pale, but determined. We started moving again as stealthily as possible, always on the lookout for any sign of our pursuers. As we walked, my mind raced, trying to think of a plan because we couldn't continue this indefinitely. The kids were tired, and honestly, so were Sarah and I. We needed help. Suddenly, I noticed a faint glow in the distance, too steady to be a flashlight, a house, a ranger station, whatever it was, but it was our best hope. I whispered, pointing light, and we're heading that way. All right, we moved faster now, hope-giving. We ran across the open ground, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind us. Emily stumbled, and I picked her up without breaking stride. We arrived at the cabin door just as our pursuers broke from the tree line, and Sarah pounded on the door, screeching for us. We had just reached the edge of the clearing where the cabin stood when we heard shouts behind us. Help! Nothing happened for a heart-stopping moment, and then the door flew open, revealing an older man with a shotgun. He barked and his eyes widened as he saw our terrified faces and the men running towards us. We didn't need to be told twice. We dove inside, and the man slammed the door behind us and threw the bolt. Just as our pursuers arrived at the porch, he demanded that his shotgun be kept ready. His face huddled in the safety of Tom's cabin. I held my family close as we waited for the police to arrive. He said, "Damn Hawkins boys, you've been terrorizing folks around here for years." He then moved to an old-fashioned phone on the wall, the first functional phone we'd seen in hours, and began dialing. "This is Tom Granger out on Old Mill Road," he said into the receiver. "Get a family here being chased by the Hawkins gang. Send everyone you've got." As I heard the faraway wail of sirens approaching, I silently vowed that going forward, my family's safety would always come first. The flashing lights of the police cars lit up the clearing, and for the first time since our car broke down, I felt like I could breathe again, that we had survived, that we were together, and that I had survived. Long time, our shortcut had turned into the longest night of our lives, a nightmare that could have ended very differently if it weren't for a little bit of luck and the generosity of a stranger. Realized was the most amazing journey of all.